trustees in person here. Do we have a motion to adopt the agenda? It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Thank you. Agenda has been adopted. Public comments on agenda items. Are there any public comments at this time? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move forward to review and discussion. Item A, budget stabilization update. Dr. Fuentes.
Thank you so much, Trustee Srinivasan. This evening, we're gathered here today to take a look at the recent updates for our Budget Stabilization Committee. Our committee has been working very diligently in reviewing our budget and considering different options for the board in terms of meeting our $6 million resolution for reduction to put into place for our first interim budget for our next upcoming meeting. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Assistant Superintendent of Business, Kevin Franklin, so he can provide more context for the meeting and introduce our Budget Stabilization Committee facilitators.
All right, good evening. Our two facilitators who have led the committee are Craig McAlpin and Michael Taylor. Craig's been with the committee for the entire time since the creation of the committee, and then Michael joined about halfway through earlier this year. So both Craig and Michael will be presenting the results, and Josh and I will be here to answer any detailed questions about any of the financial data.
Okay. Well, good evening, Board of Trustees, Superintendent Fuentes, other employees of the district, community, staff, everybody who's joining us this night remotely. Just would like to first actually say happy holidays to everyone. It feels like the holidays coming in on the rain. So coming from Southern California, it was nice to see things a little different up here. I grew up in the Bay Area, so I do always like to come back. But just want to thank you and thank you for having the time for us tonight to kind of share what we've been going through for the last, I think it was May of 2022 is when the committee was first formed. So we've been meeting together a handful of times. And tonight we just wanted to kind of come up with an update and kind of share with you the recommendations that have been made by the committee. So to get started, I think I have the clicker here. Maybe. There we go. So to start the presentation tonight, we'd like to start with the agenda. We're going to have kind of four main points that we put on the agenda for this evening. The first one will be the Budget Stabilization Committee. What we'd like to do is just kind of share with you briefly the purpose, the history, the rules, some of the steps we went through just as a committee. The second one will be the challenge, which essentially is kind of why are we here? Why are we at this point tonight? And so what we want to do is some of the main parts of this will be the recap the Santa Clara County Office of Education letter, and then talk about some of the structural issues that have brought us to where we are again today with this challenge, which is the declining enrollment, the structural deficit. The overall structural deficit is a fancy way of saying, if you will, a deficit that's been ongoing instead of just kind of a one-time or a short time. A structural deficit means a deficit that's been kind of ongoing for years. And then lastly, talk about the COVID money and how that has played into the district and the multi-year projection, the MYP. And then the most important this really is students. Right? At the end of the day, why are we all here as students? And so what we really want to also focus on is what is the impact to the student learning experience at Berryessa going to be because of all these monetary issues that we're going to be discussing. And then the third part will be kind of the main part of this presentation. Some of these at the beginning, just because in the essence of time and it's holidays and I know everybody's very busy, we'll try to go through some of these a little quick. So please raise your hand if you do want me to slow down, but some of this stuff is more of a history part. Maybe we'll try to go through that a little quicker so we can more focus on the number 3, which again is talking about the pros and cons for recommendations. So I want to make sure we have the time for that part of the main part of the presentation tonight, and then finish with the next steps will be the last part. Okay, so the purpose and the history. Again, this is kind of what is a purpose. And again, the budget, the BSC, the Budget Stabilization Committee, is an advisory capacity only. Again, we are brought together to advise overall what's going. And so part of this is the understanding of the budget development. And I want to share that Connor, who's on the Teamsters, it really warmed my heart, I have to be honest. About 2 meetings ago, he used the term structural deficit in the middle of all these conversation. It just, I think both Michael and I felt good, and even Josh and Kevin as well, of, hey, we are really starting to discuss this, and it's really maybe sinking in terms of some of the issues that we're talking about. So I know that made us all feel good in terms of some of these tough discussions that we're having. But again, also part of this is a transparency, the involvement, the consideration of budget improvement opportunities. When we say budget improvement opportunities, want to focus on that is not only expenditures, right? That's also the revenue part of bringing in the money to the district and looking at the revenue. So just want to make sure that we focus on not just one versus the other. And then the last part, again, there's the committee, is where we are tonight, which again is the proposed recommendations to the superintendent and board of education, and that's where we are tonight. But before we go any further, I do want to just thank personally, on behalf of Michael and I both, just all the members who were on that budget stabilization committee. It is not an easy committee to be on. You're dealing with tough subjects, but I just want to really thank all those folks. Hopefully they're listening in tonight, but just want to thank them for their honesty, for their discussion, for their questions, for their pullback, if you will, because again, some of this stuff is not easy to discuss when it again is going to affect the students of the district and the education. So just want to thank all of them, and also as well, Kevin and Josh have been just really helpful in terms of answering any questions that we have. We're outside consultants, so we're trying to come in from afar, if you will, and look at the overall financial picture of the district. But obviously, we need to get some information from them. So just want to thank them as well for the information they provided. But also, there's the local part that we are not part of this district that they really have been provided us. So just want to thank them as well. And then the history. So why are we here? So again, as we all know, and again, I'll try to go through these a little quicker so we can focus on the meat part of this presentation this evening. But back in 2019-20, the Santa Clara County Office of Ed advised the district to start looking at a budget stabilization plan because they were kind of concerned about the long-term fiscal picture of the district. And so then back in 21-22, they required the board to adopt a resolution, which you all did, I should say, back on June 15th of 2021 to adopt Resolution 2013, talking about identifying $6 million in reductions in 22-23 and 23-24. So again, just want to share the quick history for maybe those who are also new to this conversation this evening about where the past has been and where we're going forward. And then the Stabilization Committee was formed in May of 2022. Again, I was part of that initial as an outsider to be brought in. And part of the reason for the real reason for Budget Stabilization Committee is to just get a lot of stakeholders from the community and have them all brought in so that it's not just maybe 1 or 2 people or 3 people sharing ideas. You're getting buy-in from a lot of different folks that are part of this district. So it's a great way to bounce ideas off. And so again, the committee was formed, and we had 8 meetings, and again, referenced one recently with Connor, but had a lot of good meetings. Started off virtually, and then it was nice to be able to meet in person. I think that also really generates good conversation when you're able to see people face to face. And then again, as mentioned, myself and Michael Taylor are the 2 independent consultants, and I think shouldn't use the word lead. I think just facilitate. We didn't lead this in terms of lead, but it was really facilitating the conversation. So again, the committee representatives are listed right there, and again, just want to thank them all for this. And I think you guys will appreciate in terms of the documentation and the what we're going to provide tonight, the detail and the thought process that went through. Again, not easy decisions, but I think you'll see that a lot of thought was really brought into everything that we're going to be presenting tonight. And the perception. So this was just kind of a question we tried to start off the whole part of the Budget Stabilization Committee with. And this is kind of like, the part about what are we here for? What are your budget perceptions? What is kind of the word on the street, if you will? And so I think it was very interesting, to see, to kind of hear from folks who are saying, we don't trust it. We don't know if the numbers are correct. Why is there always this doom and gloom feeling that's going on? So it was just very interesting to kind of hear people's of feelings about what are the perceptions, and most of them were negative. And so that's where our job was. What we kind of want to do is start off with kind of Budget 101. We're going to start explaining to you some of the parts that bring up the budget. We're going to share that with you as the board in a moment here as well. But just kind of hearing those negative perceptions. And then number 2 is just how do we get beyond your budget perceptions in terms of if they are negative? So communication, again, that's a key part. I know myself and some of the board was as well at this CSBA symposium last week in San Francisco. And obviously that's a big part that was brought up in a lot of different seminars, regardless what it's about. People in the community want to know because it is their students or their neighbor kids or whoever it is, but the communication is a big part. So we've really tried to make sure that we're constantly sharing and communicating the ideas and what's being brought out of those stabilization committees. And along with that is just transparency. Again, a very important word in all parts of life, but especially in education. So especially with dollars. And then the ground rules. We'll go through these just quickly. But again, we just want to share this with you as well tonight, that this is a committee that we don't just kind of show up and talk, that we had very specific expectations. And so these are some of the ground rules that we talked about. Just one speak at a time. Each person has their own views, and we have to be respectful of that. Give everybody a chance to speak. We ask people sometimes to raise their hand. It got a little hot a few times, but nothing out of control at all. But there's a few times we just said, let's take a step back, because again, these are tough topics. So again, and just agrees to make an effort to stay on track, ask clarifying questions. So again, I think we had very good communication throughout the meetings that we had. And again, kind of the last two, especially the last one, or second to last, excuse me, each person reserves the right to disagree. We all don't have to come there and agree with everything, but let's at least hear each other out. So I think it was very open conversations that we had. Okay, so now we're going to get kind of part of why are we again here tonight. What is the challenge, if you will, of why we have a budget stabilization committee for the district? So again, as mentioned with the Santa Clara Office of Ed, a letter that was brought to the board and the superintendent back in August 28th of 2023. They were concerned about the financial future of the district in terms of where the multi-year projection shows that the numbers are going to be going forward. And again, quickly, I know Kevin and Josh have probably talked about this, but an MYP is going to focus on the current year that you have, which would be the 23-24 school year, and then the 2 out years, which are the next 2 years that are going to be forthcoming. So they're going to look at that, but obviously they're going to have probably a larger view overall and look at the out years as well past that. So they provided an approval of a conditional approval, if you remember back to a few months ago. And essentially what that means is they're approving your budget if some certain things are met. And the first requirement, as we noted on the presentation here, was to submit an updated MYP on October 9th with proposed revenue increases and expenditure decreases. So again, that was what was just a simple proposal. Again, nothing was in concrete or anything like that at all, but that was a proposal. And now on the last two, we put some quotes on there about I continue to have concerns for long-term health of the district. And then the last one which is truly where we are today. By December 15th, I'm requesting documentation of, and the key word here is detailed board approved stabilization plan. So again, why we're here tonight. So that's what they want to see. Now what they want to see is the action, if you will, for proposals now becoming approved reductions in the budget. So does anybody have any questions on this piece so far? Okay. So this is one of the main reasons why we're here, right? If everybody looks at this, you're going to see a downward slide, and this is obviously about enrollment. This is how many students are in the district, and this is essentially the main reason why we are here tonight, because the district has had a decrease since 2016-17 to 25-26 is documented here, even went back a few years before that. But why we're here today in terms of what needs to be done is an enrollment has dropped, but the problem that the district had is that the expenses have not been reduced to offset these enrollments. So the next slide, not to give away what the next slide is going to be, I'm sure everybody's looked at it already, but you're going to see the same downward slide, whereas what you want to see is that almost going flat or up, obviously, but the point is just simply that reductions in expenditures have not occurred, and so that's where they need to follow this enrollment history trend. So just want to make a few quick points on here, and I'm going to flip to my notes because I want to make sure I say this number correctly, if that's okay. But if you use, sorry for this, on 21-22, if you see at the bottom, and then to 22-23, you see that the district had 6,258 students enrolled. And then the next year, it dropped down to 5,940. So just to look at my notes, that was a drop of 318 students. But just to show the gravity in terms of the dollars and what that does to your budget, that, and using a round number, if you will, this is roughly, but there's obviously different factors for every student. Every student has a little bit of different money that they're going to bring, but let's just use 12,000 just for conversation's sake right now, roughly about what you get per student. That's $3.816 million that you lost just in that 1 year by this decline in students. So just want to use that as a reference to show the gravity of this decline in enrollment and the steep decline that's gone on for years. Now, do want to at least share some overall positive news. Again, I would like to share that these the numbers in blue are from, I believe that was beginning of October. Is that correct? Okay, so those were the CalPADS or the census data for that time period. So you can see that you actually had a little increase. The green boxes are represented at unaudited actuals. That's essentially when you close the books, and that was toward the middle of middle to end of August, and then the report was presented to the board in September. But what this is showing is that and I apologize, the red dots went over the top of the numbers, but it was projected for this year to be at 5,893. But at that point, at the beginning of October, it was currently at 6,073. So that's positive news. So don't want everything to be negative tonight, but that was at least positive news that there are some kids coming. But again, the caution, if you will, for right now is just simply it is still December. There's still many more months in the school year. And historically, there are a lot of trends sometimes where kids will maybe not come back from Christmas break or families move. So again, just want to use that as positive news, but that's something to be really obviously watching. I know the team here and the team that they have are obviously watching this because this is a huge, huge factor in many decision. So anyway, does anybody have any questions on the enrollment history?
So one thing to note here is pre-COVID, 2019-20, the enrollment was 6,800. And as we came out of COVID, it dropped to 5,940, and now it's 6,070. So the net pre-COVID to today is about 780 students, give or
Right,
take.
right.
And that translates to about $8 million. Would it
Probably,
would
yeah.
that be
I don't have the math, but yeah, 3 million was
approximately,
one
right?
year. Yeah, and one question that was brought up a lot in the Budget Stabilization Committee meetings is where are the students going? And so we did a little bit of analysis to look. And one factor I thought that was very interesting is obviously in this tech community that Berryessa is obviously very much located in, there are a lot of people that looks like they're on work visas, and maybe those visas are ending, or maybe their job went somewhere different. But there's a lot of students that fell in that category when we kind of did some analysis to try to understand. Because of course, and I've gone through it myself, my sister-in-law, brother-in-law, they were probably like many people here, moved to Texas. We've all gone through that. But an interesting one is just the tech sector jobs that people weren't coming back to this area and going somewhere different. So that was a big part of the decline overall. But there's obviously numerous factors going to neighboring districts, going to private school, homeschool. I mean, there's so many reasons. Okay.
I have a quick question again. So you pointed out the 2021 to 2022 and then the 2022 to 2023 number. Can you repeat how many students and how many students we lost and how much that is equivalent to in dollars again?
Yeah, and again, it's not an exact number. I was just trying to make a reference of using 12,000, but from 21-22 to 22-23, it's always hard to say the 20s, it was 318 students.
Mm-hmm.
And then at $12,000 per student, the loss in revenue in state aid, if you will, to the district was $3.816 million.
3.186.
3.816.
$3.816 million.
Yes.
Okay.
Or 3.8 million. And I was just using that as a simple, just to try to drive home the point. We could obviously do the math on all those and kind of see the change, but just wanted to show the gravity in terms of what this slide is really representing. And so, as I mentioned, the next slide unfortunately has the same trend, and that's again the real unfortunate big issue of kind of why we're here tonight. And you can see it's a structural deficit. And so what I'd like to point out as we just look at the slide and kind of let it soak in is if you go back to 17-18, it was up at 25%. And so this is representing the ending fund balance, which is at the top of the screen. And so, what is ending fund balance? And let's just use our own personal lives, right? We have a job, we bring in X amount of dollars, and then we have all these expenses that we're going to have throughout the month. But how does our bank account end at each day or the end of the month? That's kind of essentially what the ending fund balance is, your revenues minus your expenditures and kind of where you finish off. And so what this is talking about is unrestricted dollars that again, back to 17-18, it was 22.46. And now the concerning part is in 22-23 and forward, now you're at 3%. And why I would just want to bring up 3% right now, I'm sure Kevin and Josh have drilled home this kind of number to in the past, but 3% is the reserve for economic uncertainty that districts the size of Berryessa need to maintain in the state of California. So if you go below 3, that's when all of a sudden more things like the letter from the Santa Clara County Office of Ed are going to come forward. And so 3% is just kind of a big deal number, if you will, in terms of that can allow you, that's not going to allow you, I'm trying to think of a better word. That's going to essentially make the budgets and all the reports be qualified. And there's going to be a lot more looking at all the numbers and a lot more analysis that's going to be done by the county and potentially by the state as well. So just the big concern about the slide again is it's following the same trend as the enrollment in terms of declining, because as I mentioned at the beginning, what you'd want to see is as the decline's going on, the expenses are going to start going down because you know you're going to have less students to sustain all those expenses. So the problem is, again, showing this slide, it's going down, and now you're at that 3%. So this is where, again, why the letter came from the Santa Clara County Office of Ed, and we need to make sure that we get above that, because again, if one small thing can change that to where all of a sudden you're below the 3%. So does anybody have any questions about this? This was a lot of time was spent at the Budget Stabilization Committee meetings as well, because again, this is kind of what the number, if you will, that the gentlemen here have to live by in terms of really kind of focusing on, because this is what the multi-year projection is really focused on all the time, every single year. So, yes.
So looking at 2020 or 2020, 2021, 2021, 2022, there is about a $5 million drop. 2020, during the time, we did get a lot of one-time dollars, and there was no ADA, what is it called, penalty or anything like that, right? In spite of that, we had that drop where they're not able to.
Correlates with the loss of students during that same time period.
But if the ADA is held true, if it's not, there's no penalty with because they didn't do the ADA adjustments, right, for 1 year. So why I understand it'll be the number will drop, but I'm just curious why it's just such a steep drop.
Yeah, so there was the ADA hold harmless, but at the same time, in 2021, 2020, 2021 to then 21, 22, there was COVID relief, but there was also a lot of the requirements of you can't reduce the number of staff, you couldn't lay anybody off, you had to maintain staffing levels, and then we were also facing requirements of challenges that were things like virtual, learning, and then returning to the classroom and all of those things. And so we didn't necessarily recognize all of the revenues also back then, but we had this deficit spending issue already built into the budget at those same ADA levels prior, which is why we got that original letter in 1920 stating that we needed to start developing a stabilization plan at that time. So the deficit spending already existed, and it continued, and it was just exacerbated by the pandemic. So even though we did get some of those revenues, they were restricted in their one time, and they were not within the unrestricted side of the general fund. We still had those high expenditures on the unrestricted side, and those did continue.
And as Kevin said, just to kind of piggyback off of that, and that's where the term structural deficit comes on. This is kind of the slide that drives home the point to that term structural deficit. You can see the deficit's been continuing, and by deficit just meaning the overspending, and so it's making the ending fund balance go down year after year after year.
So you're saying the $5 million drop from 21 to 22 is mainly due to expenditures that we had to do relating to the pandemic that one-time dollars did not help us with, so we had to cut into the ending fund balance? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, so we were already deficit spending to around the $4 or $5 million mark at that time, and so those revenues came into the restricted side of the budget, and we did have additional expenditures there, and we did move some of those expenditures there, but there were other things, as Craig mentioned, as the students drop, we need to reduce expenditures. We were already overstaffed in prior years, and then we had to maintain those staffing levels. So we're always kind of playing catch up with our student decline and ADA decline. So those in 21-22, we should have been making adjustments from the 18-19, 19-20 school year and being overstaffed. And then what happened was we were having to stay at the same staffing levels that were already high and having to continue that while also paying for additional costs due to the pandemic.
Okay, I think I'm slightly understanding it, but it doesn't correlate. The slope on the enrollment history seems a lot more stable than the ending fund balance history. I'm just so intrigued as to why the slope is so much higher between the pandemic and the following year after that. And so is it only because of declining enrollment? Because if enrollment is kind of like stably, I would expect the drop to be from like the 2022 and 2023, the 318 students, that drop to be higher than the 2020 to 2021. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to figure out like why is that slope higher? I'm just not really understanding.
Yeah, so I mean, they're not going to always correlate anyway, but the other thing that we had too, we get different amounts of money per student depending on grade level. So at that time, we had middle schools that were very large, 800 students, and now they're around 600 students. And that those large groups that generate higher dollar amounts per student were exiting, and then they're being backfilled by students who have a lower revenue dollar amount per student. So that's part of it. And so you're not going to see that exact match. And so then we're also having to then make adjustments to our staffing. And then also in 21-22 to 22-23, we also had things like our retirement incentive, things like that, where yes, we're going to save money in the future, but there are starting to be expenditures going out as we're having to pay some of those retirement incentive costs. That's just one example. But that's why also, am I missing anything else, Josh? I think there was then there's just some of the other factors that are still at play too. Increased special ed costs, things like that, special ed requirements, those all continued to rise. Inflation, rise in cost, gas. I remember just from, I think in March 2020 to June 2020, I think, or was it 2020? I think it was in 2021. And I'm looking over at Dan because Dan had to come over to us and say within like 2 or 3 months, they spent double what they normally would spend on our buses and our white fleet within like a 2 or 3 month period. And we had to just increase our gas purchase orders, and then gas continued to shoot up, and we had to then increase. So we had large increases in those type of expenditures that were unplanned, and that, there's not an amount of students that can make that up. And those are just increased costs. But yeah, Dan visited Josh and I a few times within like 2 or 3 months because of how quickly those costs were rising. Another big cost, just because I thought about it, between 1920, 2021, and 21-22 is liability insurance has gone up, I think, over $500,000.
So it's liability insurance, the increased inflation, and then middle schoolers also graduating out. So that's why there
A
is
lot
that
of those
higher,
are just some of the
like
factors.
different factors.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. We'll move on to the next slide. Oops. Oh, here we go. So this is one slide, and let me go back just one quick second. I just want to make a quick point as we move forward in our presentation. We will see this slide again in a moment. And what this is going to do, we're going to see different numbers toward the last 3 years. Mr. Taylor is going to make a presentation about some of the recommendations and how those will affect what the numbers look like. So just want to share that we're going to see this slide again, and then the next one I'll show just kind of briefly here, and then the next slide as well. So I just want to make a quick point to tell you guys the next 3 slides we'll see again, but the numbers are going to look different. But with this slide, just this is one that actually has the restricted. So the number that's obviously jumping out at everyone when you look here is that 12 point, is that 6? I have glasses on, I can't even see it. 12.6 million. And what that is representing is the restricted dollars, and the main piece of that was COVID. And the reason we're just simply bringing this up, and obviously we want to share it here as well, but in some ways, for a lot of districts, I was going to say in California, but I think nationwide, our company's working with some districts outside of California, that COVID kind of put an umbrella over some of the expenditure issues going on, and everything looked good. If that's a simple way to say it, kind of a layman's terms way of saying it, but it's because there was all this money. So maybe we weren't having to deal with some of the issues in terms of like, hey, we got to look at some of these cuts. We need to look at some of these issues that are causing us to have a structural deficit. COVID kind of masked that. And so we just wanted to make a quick point today just to show you how big that number was for your district. Also within that is some of the new restricted programs that have come out recently as well. So I don't want to say that that number is 100% COVID, but there's ELOP, art and music has come about now. So there's some new restricted programs that have come about, but just wanted to show you the gravity of what COVID, the dollar amount that your district and so many other districts got in the state of California. And then the last slide before we move on to the next part of the presentation, the recommendations, And this is the deficit spending. I know Kevin just mentioned the term deficit spending. What this is doing is showing is obviously the black line across the top there, if you will, is zero. Everything in red is where the district, it's kind of like if grandma gives you a dollar and then you go buy a candy bar and it's $1.25. Well, maybe you got a quarter from your friend or somebody else. That's kind of deficit spending. You really only had $1, but you spent more than it was. That's essentially what's going on here. And this is showing that we went back to 17, 18 for this slide, that the district has had continual years of deficit spending. Again, this is part of that structural deficit term that we've used. And then recently it does show, and Kevin, if you want to expound on that at all, just because there is positive news, if you will, in that last year. But again, that's barely above the line. That's not necessarily ending the structural deficit by any means. And so if you want to expound on that, just since you're.
Yeah, and so then just to also, as Josh reminded me too, one of the main reasons too that you can see here, the 21-22, which correlates with the ending fund balance, is we had salary settlements also that were 4%, and then I think even our off schedule got paid out in that following year. So the salary settlement cost over $3 million for that year as well. So that's part of that increase in the deficit spending on the unrestricted general fund side. And then what you can see here too is that we had deficit spending projected for this current year, the next year, and then a slight positive. And that's because we were trying to incorporate reductions due to the declining enrollment and adjusting for ADA. And then we also had the adjustment for the increase in students that Craig mentioned earlier. So we had that increase. We recognized that when we submitted our multi-year projection back in October to the county to get the actual budget approval as part of what the condition was for their budget approval. And so with that led to higher revenue in the out years. And so that ended up taking us into the positive in the third year. So the increase in students this year is great, but it doesn't really bring any actual additional revenue this year because we're funded based off of a rolling average of our prior 3 years. So unless you have a current year ADA that's higher than that average. So yes, we do have more students this year. We'll probably get a little bit more supplemental income, supplemental revenue for those students. But as far as LCFF dollars, there's no increase this year. That increase is realized in the next 2 years. So, that's kind of a good thing and a bad thing because you have an influx like we do this year of TK students, but we don't get recognition for those students and the increased cost that's associated with them until the following year. So hopefully that makes sense.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm going to introduce Mr. Taylor. Thank you for the time. I might jump back up as well, but just want to say these are tough decisions to make. Myself and both Mr. Taylor have been CBOs for years at districts, and we've gone through a lot of the same stuff. So I do appreciate the format that the superintendent set up for the budget stabilization. I think that was very wise to just have, again, that transparency and a lot of different stakeholders involved. So I think that was really a lot of good conversation came about. So from that, we'll kind of talk about the recommendations. So I'll let Mr. Taylor have the podium.
Well, thank you, Craig. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What I'd like to do before we head into the next set of slides is to provide a little more context based on what you just heard. Craig has done a very nice job in kind of setting the stage as to where the district has been and also the challenges that the district will continue to face if some hard decisions are not made. So let's start with the context. I'm adding a little bit more context. Let's talk about COVID. COVID has had a tremendous effect on school districts. Even now that we're past COVID, as I want to say your name, board member Joe?
Haug. Yeah,
Haug.
Haug. Yeah.
So your point about the significant decrease in that 1 year, and then in the next year, you see a spike in the restricted column. And that's because of a huge influx of COVID dollars. So COVID dollars kind of came in, they trickled in at the very beginning during the pandemic, and then there was a massive infusion of dollars to districts. So that could be one of the reasons that you see that huge decrease, because districts had to buy PPE right away. And all those COVID dollars didn't show up just in one day. It took some time for those COVID dollars to actually come in. So there were two factors. one, COVID and the impact on school district as far as additional expenditures. Second, declining enrollment. As Craig mentioned, the district has been losing kids for a number of years, and you've been losing millions of dollars in revenue for a number of years. And when you have a healthy ending balance, you can absorb that. But you can only absorb it for so long, because that ending balance at one point will run out. It will run out. The other thing, I want to commend you all for, usually when we give these kinds of presentations, people have math anxiety because we show a lot of numbers, we show a lot of graphs, and I got to say, you guys are doing a really good job in keeping up and asking some really good questions. So let me see if I can get this going. Recommendations. So a big shout out to the committee. We had some passionate conversations, and I want to use the word passion, because there were some passionate conversations about some of these issues. This is a tough subject. A lot of different opinions, a lot of different viewpoints, but that's good for the conversation. And these recommendations that you're about to see are a result of those tough conversations, those different perspectives coming to the table, and not having 2 or 3 people sitting in a smoke-filled room and coming up with the grand plan. The Budget Stabilization Committee was a collaborative effort where all voices were allowed to be heard. So recommendations, and I'm going to go through each one of these separately. And right now you see a blank slate. Moving forward, well, let me just explain the green. Those are revenue recommendations, renting and leasing district property, selling district property, and the yellow are expenditure reductions. And we're going to go through each one of them separately and talk about the pros and cons for each one of them and allow you to ask questions about every one of them. So one of the questions we were asked, well, when is this funding for these recommendations? When would the district be able to use that funding? In the first year, this year, not going to see any funding from any of these initiatives because we're already into the fiscal year. And selling district property is a long process. Consolidating and merging schools is a long process. Staffing reductions, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes, that's a process. That doesn't happen in a couple of weeks, doesn't happen in a couple of months. And a supplemental early retirement program, again, it's a process. It does not happen in a couple of months. So the first year, the year that we're in now, you're not going to see any funding drop to the bottom line. Now that changes when we get to next year, where we have the potential of about $4.5 million being available to the district to address its budget and fiscal challenges. Item number 1, renting and leasing empty sites or classrooms. A possibility. We estimate about $756,000, but it could be higher, it could be less, and it's not guaranteed. And again, we're going to talk about them individually. Next year, the following year, 25-26, selling district property is probably the big ticket item. And during the committee, when we talked about this, a lot of the members said, Craig and Michael, $42.5 million, we're done. Let's go home. Not so fast. Not so fast. And we're going to talk about this in detail. Consolidating emerging schools. If you have declining enrollment, do you have excess capacity at your sites? And the answer is probably yes. Do you have a school, as an example, that has a capacity of 800, but only 350 kids in them? And is that an adequate utilization of your school district facility? It's a rhetorical question, but I think this is an area where the district could realize some savings, some potential savings. And we're going to talk about this in detail also. Item number 4, and this was a very contentious issue within the committee. Very difficult because you're talking about people's lives. You're talking about their income. So we spend a lot of time talking about this. But the challenge here is when you have declining enrollment and you're losing millions of dollars and your expenditures are not being reduced correspondingly, that's going to catch up to you. And that's where we are. The declining enrollment, the loss of millions of dollars in revenue, and expenditures staying relatively constant has caught up to the district. And as Craig mentioned, the COVID dollars help mask that because of that infusion of millions of dollars. But those are one-time dollars, and they will run out. In fact, ESSER 3 will run out in September of 24. So again, just providing that context so you fully understand the gravity of the situation. Item number 5, supplemental early retirement program. A lot of districts use this as a method to have people retire, and we give them an incentive to retire. And I think based on, Kevin, I think you've all have done a supplemental early retirement program about 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm not sure if you, when you run the numbers, there's usually a technical term, a scattergram. How many people are eligible to retire? And if the number isn't big enough, the program doesn't pencil out. The financials do not pencil out. And right now, it was brought up as a recommendation, but it's probably based on preliminary data. It's probably not going to pencil out. So again, these are the initiatives and also when you could expect to see the benefits, i.e. the financials or the dollars associated with each of those benefits in each year. So I want to come to a full stop. I know I've just presented you with some information. There's more to come. Any questions? Sir.
With the supplemental early retirement program, if it does materialize, there is a cost involved to have those employees retire. So does that offset some of the other, I would imagine it'll offset some of the other costs, savings that we might have. Craig, is there any?
So as a rule of thumb, supplemental early retirement plans, the way districts essentially derive savings is getting a large number of teachers to retire. But districts are usually always forced to also offer the supplemental early retirement program to classified people. And because certificated salaries tend to be higher, that's where districts can actually realize some savings. And districts realize savings in either not backfilling those positions when people retire, or they bring in a relatively younger teacher at a lower salary, and the districts realize the savings in that increment. The more, I would say, mature teacher is probably at the far end of the salary schedule. You bring in a younger teacher and you have a salary differential. So there are two ways to derive savings: the salary differential or not backfilling positions. So hence, to your question, if you have enough people, specifically certificated, a CERP could work. And it also depends what kind of incentive you give them. If you give them 50% of the salary, 60, 70, I've seen districts give 80 to 90%. And those are some very healthy retirement incentives. So any other questions?
Will you be going over how you got the numbers like the 756K and the 42.5 million later?
Yeah, and I think we did some preliminary, we don't have the actual calculations, but we did preliminary calculations for each one of them. And so we're not going to go through the exact calculation, no.
Okay.
But we can provide that information on how those numbers were derived.
Yeah. Would be useful for later. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, now, for those of you who have math anxiety, we're going to talk about numbers. So you just saw, as Craig presented it, a similar slide. There are two fundamental changes. Well, actually one. One of the important changes here is unaudited actuals. The district closed its books for last year and was able to realize an increase in its ending balance, which means that the beginning balance for this year was a little higher. I think it was about 427,000, or thereabouts. So that helped. The second thing, and in yellow below at the very bottom of the slide, you see the Budget Stabilization Committee recommendations of 3 and 4. Let me go back. Consolidating and merging schools and staffing reductions are included in these numbers. And as you can see, the district's financial picture improves. Let me just give you, again, a little bit more context. When you look at the when you look at the far end of the graph, when you look at the far end of the graph, and you see this trajectory downward, you see that the district has an ending fund balance of above 3%, which is fine. As Craig mentioned, the state requires that a district of this size have an ending fund balance, or at least 3% set aside for economic uncertainties. You've come down from 22%. On average, elementary school districts in the state of California are around 20% on average. You're now around just above 3%. You're hovering above 3%. So you're very close. You're just barely being able to meet your financial requirements. Now, this includes the staffing reductions and also the school consolidation initiative. So the financial picture gets a little bit better. Let me just offer, again, the similar slide, the same slide, but also including the restricted dollars. And that big blip, that big spike, those are the COVID dollars. And I think the district is just about out as far as COVID dollars are concerned. And so again, those COVID dollars, most districts in the state of California received a lot of COVID dollars and were able to use those COVID dollars. I think it's also important to realize that with those COVID dollars, there was a lot of flexibility. The question that we got all the time was, Michael, can we use it for X? Can we use it for Y? Well, the language is it's not very clear. And that was on purpose, to give districts as much flexibility with using this funding in dealing with the pandemic. So again, the district's financial situation has gotten better, specifically because of recommendations number 3 and 4, and the deficit spending has also slightly improved. And again, if I could direct your attention to the very far right, instead of one small green bar, now we've got 2. And so again, because of these recommendations, the district's financial picture has gotten better. Again, structural deficit, we're still projecting a structural deficit for this year. But moving out into the out years, it looks better. Again, with these recommendations. We're going to get into each one of the initiatives, but there's some important information that you all need to be aware of if you're already not aware of it. We just recently learned from the Legislative Affairs Office, the LAO, that the projected COLA for next year is going to be an anemic 1%. I'm sorry, it's 1.27%. Let me repeat that. A COLA of 1.27%. 1.27%. Your fixed costs, your step and column, the cost for utilities, that's a lot higher than 1.27%. So that's what's on the horizon. The other major initiative. The state of California delayed collecting tax receipts from April through November. Estimated tax receipts projections are down $26 million.
Billion.
I'm sorry,
B word.
billion. Billion. Those are two major initiatives that we don't really have any answers for yet. And we're just dealing with our current situation with a 1% COLA. And we had, for next year, we had, I think, 3.9% in the budget or in the multi-year projections. How is the district going to address that? What's the state going to do with a $26 billion shortfall in revenue receipts? We don't know yet. We'll have to wait until the governor comes out with his January budget proposal. So before we get into the individual initiatives, any questions? Okay, renting/leasing district property. The pros. And I was made aware, I did not know this, that pros and cons do not have apostrophes. And I've always used apostrophes. So thank you, Berryessa, for reminding us of that, or allowing us to make that grammatical adjustment. So renting/leasing district property, pros, as was seen in the slide before, the previous slide, estimating about $756,000. Now, it could be higher, it could be lower, but there are no guarantees here. It would essentially establish a regular income stream, and it addresses the structural deficit problem. Con, limited funding. Outside entities on school district property. Getting comfortable with change. And again, there are no guarantees. Potential available sites at the very bottom, Birchwood, former district office, existing classroom space. So just wanted to highlight that.
And then, so I'll just kind of add on, since I know that you had the question about how did we arrive at some of these numbers. So what this particular dollar amount is the projected revenue if the Piedmont Road district office is rented out. It's currently up for lease. There's an RFP out, and so that's how we derived that figure. Birchwood is currently under a lease agreement, but of course, things can always change. There's limited term to that lease, and so there's always potential with that particular site as well. So I just wanted to bring that up to help clarify where those numbers came from.
And just for further clarification, the dollars from the Birchwood lease agreement is not part of the 756 because it's already a component of our existing revenue.
Correct. And because we've had the Piedmont Road office listed for lease, and there had been interest at various points in time, this dollar amount has already been included in our multi-year projection. So the change that would come about from the leasing of that property would be if we leased it and we're going to receive more revenue, or if we were going to receive revenue at an earlier date, or if we leased at a higher amount per square foot. That dollar amount was also generated from, I believe, leasing it at us still utilizing a portion of the site, and we are now going to lease the entirety of the site, so that number could go up. But again, that's all just based on the lease terms, if and when we do have a tenant, and so that's why it's not in the current year; it's in the 2 out years. And then, of course, leasing of any of the other sites or additional classroom space would generate dollars over and above that dollar amount. But just to be conservative, we did not project anything higher than what was currently out in an RFP right now. It also does not include the potential of leasing out the group of portables at Birchwood that's in the current lease agreement with Milpitas Christian School.
Was land leasing considered in rental property? Or was it only for existing facilities?
So with this was for, we didn't have a lot of discussion about land lease, but what I can tell you from the research that I've done with a land lease, the site that would be, the one site that would have potential for a land lease would be the Piedmont Road District Office property versus either Birchwood or Commodore, which would be the vacant site that we have over kind of in the Vincy Park area. And the reason being is that typically you have, commercial properties that are interested in the long-term land lease or apartment complex. And I don't think that either Birchwood or Commodore would be a viable apartment complex or commercial type site. But the Piedmont Road location potentially could be. So there would be that potential, but that was not discussed in detail with the committee. They didn't bring that up. It was more of leasing out current facilities or the selling of property, which is on the next slide.
So it's a sale of district property. We had a lot of conversation about this. And at the very bottom, potential sites, Birchwood, former district office, and Commodore. Projected revenue from a sale, almost $43 million. Part of the pros is less property to maintain, reduce insurance liability. The challenge here as we get over into the cons, as we look at a structural deficit, $42.5 million is a lot of money. However, it's one-time money. And it really does not address the district's structural deficit issue. So even though it's a large sum, it's one-time money. And we all know one-time money, if you keep using it, at some point, it will run out. So potential 7-Eleven committee, not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's a process. But since these were not, from what I understand, these properties were not used for educational purposes, or at some point there was a waiver that was extended.
Correct. So the Piedmont Road office and Commodore have never been used for anything other than their original intent, which was an office or vacant land. The Birchwood site was previously used as a school, and that's why Milpitas Christian School is leasing that property, but it was surplused in 1984. And so I don't believe it would need to be surplused again. And so since that property had been surplused, we would not be required to go through the process.
And so as we continue to look at the cons, what are the legal implications? From what I understand, the city of San Jose has some specific parameters as to who owns the property. And again, Kevin, if you could just elaborate on that.
I can go ahead and elaborate on that. So just knowing that the city does have their large urban planning vision. And so any change in zoning of properties that we would want to do in order to match a potential buyer would have to go through the City of San Jose permit process. Currently, if that intent is not in alignment with the City of San Jose's urban planning vision, it has potential to not be approved.
And then also, since this would be a process, the earliest you could probably see the funds would be 25, 26. So that's a ways out.
Michael, can you also please clarify when you sell property, the usage of that funds? Are there limitations, for example?
Yes. So getting back to number 2, legal implications. So it's not necessarily true that just because you sell district property that it all goes to the general fund. There are strict guidelines established in Ed Code as to how much of that funding from the sale of surplus property can be used in the general fund. So those are also some of the limitations associated with the sale of district property. Now, could you use it for some major deferred maintenance kinds of issues? Yes. But to transfer all into the general fund, there are very specific limitations on how much can be transferred. Kevin, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, and so there are some legislative flexibilities right now that allow for a broader use within the general fund. Those do expire though June 30th, 2024. And so my understanding is that for you to be able to have that broader use within the general fund, you have to be under contract with whoever you're selling the property to by that time frame. You don't have to have completed the sale, but have to be in agreement with that. And then even after that, there's a process like Michael mentioned. So even though you have allowable use within the general fund, you can only use it for one-time expenditures, and those expenditures have to be approved by the state allocation board. So you have to come up with a plan of expenditure, submit to the state allocation board for approval, and then they will approve that usage or disapprove the usage within the general fund. So that could help alleviate some of the strain on the general fund and some of that deficit spending. But again, it has to be approved by another entity and can only be used for one-time expenditures. So they couldn't be used for ongoing salaries, but it could be used for other one-time costs within the general fund.
So is there a percentage that is assigned that we can use in the general funds for salaries and things like that?
So with that flexibility, no, but I don't know what the parameters would be that the state allocation board is looking for allowable use. And of course, you only have a certain amount of one-time type expenditures within the general fund. So being that, over 90% of our general fund expenditures currently are for salaries and benefits, those are ongoing costs that are not one-time in nature. So that in and of itself limits the amount that can be spent for one-time purposes. That doesn't mean that you can't set dollars aside. So I believe New Haven utilized this flexibility many years ago. The only other time that I'm aware of that this provision within the Ed Code was flexible to allow this. And what New Haven did was they set aside a certain amount of the property sale as reserves that they will not touch to always maintain fiscal solvency within the district. And then they had some other one-time retirement costs that they put in their plan for expenditure, and then some other capital facilities projects and things of that nature. But they did use a portion of it as a one-time kind of payment into the general fund to set aside for economic uncertainty. And that was allowed at that time of the state allocation board.
How long ago was this case, New Haven?
I want to say it was more than 10 years ago, but you could still find it on their website. They still have that there. They still have the FAQs about the process they went through and then how much was set aside at that time.
Would the provisions that New Haven had still even apply if it was a decade ago?
Yes, because it was the same when they brought on this flexibility that was enacted, I think, 2 years ago for property sale. It's the same provisions, so it's the same rules and requirements. And I think historically, if we could point to New Haven's case, if that was something that we as the district wanted to do, I think we would have a strong case with the state allocation board to approve a plan similar in nature.
I would just add that there's probably, if the district does decide to pursue this particular initiative, that it's very important that you all get a legal opinion because of all of the different possibilities, and that you stay within education code, government code as it relates to this particular issue. Any other questions on the sale of district property?
So I have a very specific question, and I apologize, it's a very specific question for Berryessa Commodore property. So there is a lot of incentive right now under the Inflation Reduction Act for school districts to build to lease land for EV charging stations, and there's like deep discounts for school districts or tax credits for them to bring up EV charging stations. I think the Commodore property is like it's right in the middle of the neighborhood. It's open next to a park. There's nothing going on there. That could be a prime location for something like that if you want to look into something like that.
Yeah, that was something that we did internally discussed. I've had some of those discussions with staff. A lot of it is paying for that one-time upfront cost, and then how do we maintain that? How do we staff something like that? But if that is kind of the next question, is if property sale is not something that the board wants to do. We need to look at other revenue generating ideas for the property. A lot of the ideas that we have, unfortunately, come with a lot of upfront cost and a long time to recoup those costs. But we did start to look into the charging stations. We were looking at some of the portable ones, but a lot of that is just infrastructure. There's no infrastructure there right now, and so that would all have to be installed. That would all have to be paid for up front. And so that is something that we could take a deeper dive look into if that's what the board would like us to do for that potential property. And so then I will mention that the $42.5 million that you see on here under the pros, that is kind of derived from what either the Commodore or Birchwood properties would net as a property sale, just using comps for about a 10-acre site in the area. Of course, if it was the Piedmont Road office space, that's a lot less acreage. I think it's around 3 or 4 acres versus 10. So that would not net that much revenue. But those two sites, just because those are the larger sites, that was the number that was used. And specifically because the committee had been talking specifically about the Commodore property, that was why that dollar amount was utilized for this plan. 10 acres or 9.9. Yes. It's for the whole property, including the fields, except after I think either 4 or 5 p.m. and then the fields are utilized by the district. But again, because this is a long process, Milpitas Christian's lease expires in a little over 2 years. I don't know that would prohibit us from being able to look into selling of that property if that's the direction that's given. I think there's also less strict opt-out or termination language within our lease with them. With the lease extension that we gave previously, it was having to give a 3-year heads up or 3-year notice for them. I don't believe that the language is that long anymore. So, but again, the process is a long process. It would probably take 1 to 2 years to sell that particular site. We would have to rezone that site. That site, I think, is zoned agricultural, just like the district office property. So it would be a long process where I believe Milpitas Christian could probably stay at the site for the entirety of the lease.
So I kind of like the idea of doing something with the Commodore property, not necessarily selling it. What are the options there, to keep it, but yeah, generate some revenue from there, such as the charging station idea? How about sports facilities or something like that could be rented out?
Right. So sports facilities, we talked about, especially when we were talking about the purchase or the remodel of the former district office property, and what that would entail. And I think we even had run a scenario where sometimes some of the developers would come in and say, we'll do this and we can maybe help develop a site like that. We didn't get any interest on that. We had the idea of sports properties. The cost to put in a sports property on around 10 acres would be relatively high. And the amount of revenue that would come in from leasing out property for sports, it would take a long time to net positive gains out of that. But that is something that we had thought about. The other thing that we had thought about besides the charging stations, we thought of storage facility. I know that it was even brought to our attention that there's a high demand for boat storage. Again, I don't know that the community in that area would want something like that. So we have ideas. It's just, then do we want to, how much do we want to look into them, and are they realistic in bringing in positive revenue for the district?
Yeah, and these are more long-term things, but like Commodore, perhaps you know, and we don't have to sell the whole property, right? So for
Correct.
Commodore or for Birchwood, if we were to decide to sell one of those, it could be half of that, a third
Mhm.
of that. And it could still, a developer could still do something,
Correct.
you know, maybe build some homes or something like that.
Yeah, and that goes for all of our properties. So not even just those ones that are vacant or that are under lease. Some of our properties have a lot more field than what our schools currently utilize, or they just have areas of just dead grass or weeds that just aren't utilized at all by the schools. So that could be analyzed for all of our properties as well.
Yeah, actually, that's a pretty good idea. So not just, you know, the vacant properties or the properties we aren't using, but
Right.
there might be school sites that have extra land, especially, you know, the ones that where the enrollment is kind of low. And I don't know if there's a requirement for a certain number of students or just for a school site in general, if there's a requirement. But maybe, you know, at least selling bits, just bits here and bits there could get us there. And it'd be a whole lot easier than selling, like, say, 10 acres.
Right. I think the key to remember with the selling off of a piece of property is the length of time that it would take for us to do that analysis or to have a real estate consultant do that and then actually have that listed and go through all the legal items that we'd have to go through to sell off a piece of that land to realize the actual general fund flexibility that would have to be done in the next 6 months. So I'm not sure about the feasibility of that. These were highlighted because these are already surplus properties
Oh,
within
I
the
see.
district.
Yeah.
So,
And so the requirements that we do it within the next 6 months?
That is only to meet the current flexible legislation change that
Right.
current exists. Without that flexibility, though, that revenue could be placed where?
only capital facilities projects or maintenance.
Right, I mean, but that's that money could go to that, but then the savings there from those revenues could be used for other things, you know?
Right. So most of our capital projects are all done through the bond, not
Okay.
through the general fund. So we don't have any.
How about like maintenance and stuff like that?
It can't be used for routine restricted maintenance. So it wouldn't be able to be used for our daily maintenance issues that we have. It has to be for actual capital facilities projects.
And you're saying 6 months because of the June 30th expiration of that flexibility law,
Yes.
essentially?
Now, if that gets extended, I don't know if it will. If it does, that's why it's good to have these conversations, because if they do extend that flexibility, then it's good to know, and we can continue to look into some of these ideas.
The extended flexibility, is that from a state bill? And
Yes.
it just has a sunset date?
Yes.
Do we happen to know any legislators who may be working on a bill to extend that? Is that a conversation?
I haven't heard anything about advocacy towards that. That's something I've been
Interesting.
mentioning in my meetings because we're not a district alone that could benefit from having that particular language being extended past June.
So it's not a priority of like CSBA, AXA?
No, I have not seen it on anyone's formal listing yet, but a lot of those platforms are being developed right now.
And that's not to say that with a lot of the talk about school consolidation, that it can't be brought back. So as more schools have unused school sites due to the fact that enrollment is declining throughout California, it could definitely be brought back. But I haven't heard anything.
What's the act called, or the law that's sunsetting?
I have to go and look up the exact one, but I
Yeah.
can get that for you.
Yeah, yes, please. We can ask people in the legislature.
Yes.
So the 42.5, is that the net cost or the net, say, revenues from potential sale of all 3 sites or just 2? Or?
No, just one.
Oh, one
10-acre site.
Oh, 1 10-acre site.
Yes.
How much is 1 acre? So I guess it'd be about $4 million?
Yes.
So if we were to say, you know, like 1 acre at the Birchwood campus or something
Yes.
like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So former district office property on Piedmont Road would be about 10 to 12 million.
Okay. But we wouldn't have to sell. So, I mean, I'm just saying we don't have to sell the whole property. We can, because I'm not a fan of getting rid of property because we don't, I mean, first of all, it's, you know, it's an investment to have properties with the price of real estate, the way it's, you know, the direction it's headed. And then we don't know the needs of the district in the future, right? I mean, we're looking 5, maybe even 10 years down the line, but 20, 30 years, you know, land's going to be much more scarce. Populations are going to be higher. So the district
Correct.
might need then, but, you know, I think that if we have a 10-acre site, maybe, you know, being able to sell 1 acre, And we have, a couple of properties that are like that. It's 2 acres,
Yeah.
et cetera.
And that was something that the committee did talk about. And so I think when we get to the next one and talk about school consolidation, that's where the committee was then more open to the sale of a whole site like Commodore, because if we do consolidate or merge schools, then there would be a vacant site then available as well, and that we would have then unused property. So if there was growth in the future, they were satisfied with knowing that there was still a property that we could utilize again as a school site. So that's kind of some of the discussion the committee had.
Is it feasible to sell something or like get that agreement within that 6-month period though? Like, is that have we done that before in the past? Or like, is there history that school districts are able to get an agreement within that 6 months?
So that's a good question. I did talk to our real estate consultant about that. If we had things in place, which some of the sites do, some of them already have a waiver. Birchwood and the Piedmont Road property have waivers already. It is feasible. It comes down to the city of San Jose and is it part of that plan or not? And can we do that and come into contract with the developer? So when I talked to the real estate consultant, there's Pleasant and Unified is currently going through the same thing, and they were going to sell property. One of them was a 10-acre site similar to Commodore, and they got under contract within 2.5 months. And they put out an RFP, and they had 6 developers bid on the RFP.
Thank you.
So the district wouldn't have to do any kind of rezoning or anything. That's something, so say the former district office site has, I think agriculture,
Yeah.
right? So the potential developer would then purchase the site and they take care of everything?
So
would have
that's
to
actually
rezone.
contingent. So that offer for sale is contingent on that
On being able to
rezoning
rezone.
happening to their favor. So that's sort of the holdup of what's happening in Oak Grove School District right now.
Commodore is currently zoned residential.
Right.
And so that's the only one of those 3 sites that's residential at the moment.
Right, okay.
Any other questions on the sale of district property? So as you can see, a lot of moving parts, a lot of legislation involved, a lot of parameters. This legislation, the way it currently stands, the flexibility, as was mentioned earlier, is about to expire. Could the district maybe take advantage of that 6-month period? Possibly. But it's a process, the sale of district property. And I think this is a good segue into the next issue, consolidating and merging of schools.
And Michael, before you go on, I'm just going to add to the board that this evening, because of the 6-month timeframe that we have with this legislative piece, we are interested in getting feedback from the board regarding sale of district property and/or any of these ideas you've had regarding land lease and specialized projects on the vacant land that we have at the Commodore, that we get feedback this evening so that we can then move ahead and reach out to other specialists to be able to bring those potential opportunities back to the board. Okay, so I just want you, I know you're hearing a lot of information, so I want you to let that resonate before we go into the next area, because we will be seeking direction at the end.
Consolidating and the merging of schools. Again, this is a result of declining enrollment. As I mentioned earlier, this is not unique to Berryessa. A lot of school districts within the state of California have experienced declining enrollment. And so they're faced with a situation where they have excess capacity at their schools. As I mentioned earlier, a school with a capacity of 800 might only have 350 kids. Is that the adequate utilization of that school facility space? Most likely not. But a lot of districts are looking at this and had the opportunity. I think, well, I saw you all at the CSBA conference last week in San Francisco at one of the breakout sessions centered around school consolidation, school closure. And I think they had 6 breakout sessions, and I had an opportunity to go to maybe 4 of them. So this is a hot topic. A lot of districts are wrestling with what to do with this excess capacity at their sites generated by declining enrollment. So we did take a stab at this and had, I would say, a robust conversation about school consolidation, school mergers. And so looking at the pros, reduced number of combination classes, opportunity for teacher collaboration, improved differentiated instruction. So one of the questions that I asked one of the panel members at the CSBA conference, do you have any data, any metrics to support that the consolidation or the merger of schools actually helps with student achievement? And the answer was, we don't. The consensus is that the results are mixed at this point. But you do have the opportunity, as is outlined on the slide, to reduce the number of combination classes. The collaboration among teachers would be improved, and also the opportunity for differentiated instruction. Item number 2 under pros generates about $1 million. And we do have the calculation for that, the specific calculation, working with Kevin, and also a cost model that we have. We've done a few of these ourselves as a firm, working with districts on consolidating emerging schools. So we do have a very robust cost model to help us generate potential savings. It would reduce expenditures. And keep in mind that when you're consolidating emerging schools, you're probably going to have some redundant positions. Do you necessarily need 2 principals? Do you need 8 custodians? So those are some of the tough questions that you have to answer. It allows for the repurposing of schools, ensures efficient use of district facility assets, and it allows you to look not just at 1 or 2 schools. An initiative like this allows you to look at the entire district. We're working with a district now where we're looking at the entire district and looking at where is most of the decline happening and what actually makes sense when it relates to consolidating and merging schools. Now, one of the unintended consequences is when you merge 2 schools, that there's probably going to be a vacant site. Then the question is, district, what are you going to do with the vacant site? And again, that's another process. A district that I worked with about 3 months ago, one of those vacant sites was going to be turned into a sports facility. It was a high school district, a lot of athletics, and they needed more space for athletics. So one of those vacant sites was going to be turned into a sports facility. It addresses the structural deficit because you will be reducing your expenditures. And again, most of the reduction in the expenditures come on the personnel side. Now, are there some savings on material and supplies, operating expenses, routine restricted maintenance? Yes. But a majority of the savings come from personnel reductions. Now, one of the ways that districts can help mitigate that reduction in personnel is, again, by not backfilling retiree positions, also not backfilling vacant positions. Some of the cons: staff and students have to move. You will have personnel reductions because of redundant positions. There probably will be some negative community feedback because this is a very emotional issue. People are very passionate about their schools, especially neighborhood schools. My great-great-great-granddad went to these schools. I dare you. These are some of the comments that you get, and they're real. But there's also a financial reality associated with keeping schools like that open. We worked with a major, large district up in Northern California, elementary school, Capacity is 600. 150 kids in the school. You have a lot of excess capacity. It can be a lengthy process. Our recommendation, if you decide to pursue this, give yourself a long runway. Give yourself time. Do not do this fast. Think it through. Have a committee with multiple stakeholders to really talk about all the possibilities. Communicate to the community. Get feedback. Listen, and then communicate some more. And if you communicate, that's great. And you will probably do a nice job in communicating, but there will be someone that will say, no one told me. There will be one or two or three or four, no one told me. So communication, having a good communication strategy on this particular issue is very important. Getting comfortable with change, and the earliest where the funding would be available, 25, 26. So that's downstream, but definitely within the realm of the possible. So that essentially, and then also at the very bottom of the note, you'd have to set up, again, it's a process, a separate committee to help facilitate this conversation about what's possible.
So one note about the fund, the amount of funds generated from this particular recommendation. The $977,000 is an average of the average cost of a middle school and the average cost of an elementary school. So it's an average of those two. So we took, what does operating one of our elementary schools typically cost? What does operating one of our middle schools typically cost? And we average those out. So an elementary school is about $700,000 or so in savings, and a middle school is around 1.1 or $1.2 million in potential savings. So that's where that number was derived from. So again, this number is flexible. Of course, if this does move forward and it's an elementary school only, then the amount of savings that it would generate would be less. If it's a middle school, it would be more. If it's both an elementary and a middle school, then we would have a significant amount more than that in savings.
So typically the process to from start to finish to close a school site takes is that a year that it takes, or is it?
So the process to make the decision on which schools that would be impacted, I would say takes anywhere between 4 to 7 months, where the committee gets together and then comes up with a number of options, presents them to the board. You have a number of community meetings to talk about what the committee came up with. And then, again, giving yourself a long runway, give yourself about a year for planning for the closure. And also, the welcoming school might need some modernization efforts to welcome the new schools from the school that would be essentially closed. So a year gives you enough time to do that. Get the facility, the new facility, the welcoming facility ready, and also get the community as much as you can on board with this change.
Yeah, and I think too, some of what the committee discussed too is that this is not necessarily black and white, that it's this school or it's in a certain fashion. So, I mean, there were other ideas discussed of how can we reconfigure schools? Is that a K-8? Is that making, one of our schools, school sites a K-8? Is it K-6 at certain school sites? Is it, there's a lot of options. And so those are options that could be discussed that will change those dollar amounts, just dependent on what we want to do as a district. And so, like Michael said, there could be some reconfiguring of school sites. So if a K-8 was something that we wanted to look into, then that would, the site would have to be chosen, and then we would have to make adjustments to that site. So if that was taking one of the middle schools, for instance, and having that become a K-8 school, then of course playgrounds would have to be added, classrooms would have to be adjusted to have kindergarten students and some of the younger age students in restrooms. So some of those are costs that we would have to incur to do that, but those are ideas that the committee discussed, and they know that that's then going to be further discussed by another committee on how to do this process, but those are ideas that were discussed during this process.
So sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
So-
I'll add later.
Yeah. So one thing you just mentioned, K6, that's been in my mind for a while, but I was not sure about the logistics of how that would work. But anyway, my question is, and not to alarm anybody in the room, if we decide today to close one particular site, for example, from today, it would take a year, give or take, to close that site. 2022, 23, 24, and then we immediately realize the revenue in 25, 26, or is it still one more year after that?
It would be 25, 26.
So as soon as we
So we're
close,
currently in
Right.
23, 24.
Yeah.
We would have the process go through and into the 24, 25
And
fiscal year.
let me just add, there's 3 phases to the process, and they can vary in terms of time based on the conversations. The first phase is going to be the longest because the first phase will be an initial committee that comes together, and there's quite extensive research that has to go into this process. There's lots of variables that's going to be considered. They'll have to look at enrollment of every school site. They'll have to look at what are the trends of the incoming kinder students, incoming 6th graders for every site. They'll have to examine the facilities. What is the condition of the facilities? So when we have, a vacant site, how is that going to be in terms of easily accessible for lease or whatever we choose to do with that site, right? So all of those components this committee will review. They will also review traffic patterns, safety zones. Where do children live in the neighborhood? What's their capacity to get to a new school? The legislature passed a recent bill knowing that statewide, California is facing declining students, and that school consolidation is going to be something most districts are going to have to address. There's now an equity analysis that's required to be done by this committee. So that's another review process. So that phase 1 is going to be the most extensive. Then once that committee presents to the board different scenarios, different configurations, that's where the programming will also be discussed there, right? What is that vision for learning environments for our children? Is it K-8? Is it K-6? What does that look like? So all of those topics will be discussed with that committee. Then once they present that to the board, then at that point, the board would make the decision. You're not making a decision to close or consolidate schools tonight. We're just looking for direction to commence this committee to do this review process. And then they will bring that information back to the board. And based on those scenarios created by them, then the board will take action based on that feedback. If at that point, the board does decide to move forward with saying, okay, we like, one or two of these scenarios the committee has provided, and it does involve, school consolidation or merger or creation of a new type of school, then we'll go into, the board will take action to approve that recommendation. Then we go into phase 2. Phase 2 now is another committee, which is the 7-11 committee, which now has to, there's lots of regulation, state regulation that group will need to adhere to determine what do we now do now that we know which sites will be available for potential lease or sale. That committee will do a review process of that and bring that recommendation back to the board. And simultaneously, I would recommend we'd have another committee over here on the side that is also working on transition of those students to their new locations. Because you want to make sure that there's planning for that in terms of addressing the needs of those families, of those students, of the staff, how to welcome them into, a new school site. So that would be another planning process. If that makes it a little bit more clearer of what those steps could include.
Any more questions on consolidating and merging of schools? Okay. So staffing reductions. The pros, the funding would be available, and there's specific positions that have been identified. And they're not listed here. But what we have is the potential savings on not backfilling those positions. So the funding would be available next year. And next year would be about $3.7 million. And the following year would be about $4.1 million. And I want to make a distinction that the 3.7 would be ongoing. And then so you would have an additional 300 or 400,000 tacked on to that 3.7 to get you to the 4.1 million. The district recommendation to help mitigate the impact of this, use retiree positions and vacant positions and not backfill them to help mitigate the impact of this staffing reduction. District probably should look at its staffing ratios, teacher to student ratio at each of the sites. Are you at 24-1? Are you at 30-1? How does that align with the current contract? This would definitely address your structural deficit because you are reducing expenditures on an ongoing basis. Cons, layoffs. That is just one of the consequences of this particular initiative, and then also the potential negative morale. So funding would be available next year. At the very bottom right, you see in yellow the number of FTEs, certificated, classified, and management.
Then I know Michael pointed this out too, the LAO putting out the COLA at about 1.27%. A reduction from the current 3.94 down to 1.27 would be just under $2 million in revenue for us. So if that's what the governor's budget is in January for next year as far as the COLA, and then again, just because that's the statutory COLA, because of the tax revenue shortfall, is the COLA going to be funded? That's another question to ask. Is there going to be any backfilling of that? Will they fund above the COLA with some of the rainy day funds? Any of that? We have to take that into consideration. So an additional $1.5 to $2 million in additional reductions on top of this may be necessary for us to identify between now and the second interim. So this information just came out last Friday, so it's all relatively new, which is why it's not in our first interim. We're moving forward with the 3.94%, but that's what's going to be necessary between first interim and second interim is the recognition that the revenues could drop as a result of the COLA being calculated at a lower percentage.
And so to add on to that, and I think you just alluded to it, Kevin, is we don't know yet on how these two issues are going to unfold. But is this an opportunity for the state to use its rainy day fund? And is it raining? A lot of districts will be impacted by this. So it seems that this would be a perfect opportunity to invoke or use the rainy day fund to make sure districts are not severely impacted by this information. And then also, I'm sure you all know, next year is an election year. And so things can happen. Let me just leave it that way.
What did you have a question?
Yes, the numbers in the yellow box are those positions that are being recommended for potential layoffs.
Yes, so those are positions that we've come up with that would get us to the amount of savings that we specify here, which get us to a balanced budget that you could see on those previous slides and get us into the positive in that about $1.2 million or so on the third year.
So, positions exactly do that. Those-
We don't have titles at this time. The certificated positions on the first line, and Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, but that also is inclusive of what we typically do year to year based on student enrollment.
Yes, so that takes into account some of the positions that we already planned for and reducing because of declining enrollment from year to year.
And so, so knowing that, going back to the pros side, in terms of the process, we always go to any retirees. Those will be counted against those numbers. Any staff members that move out of the district, for new opportunities, et cetera, that will all go against those figures. And we will not backfill, those positions unless required to do so. So that's our first attempt. So, I know that for certificated, there's a long lane for them to tell us for retirement. They don't need to tell us right away, but we would encourage our staff members to let us know if they know that they plan to retire, if they know that they're moving and are going to be going to, a new workplace. The sooner we know that information, the better it will be for us and to support to the staff that do stay with us. So that way we can provide more accurate numbers of what we need to reduce.
And that was brought up multiple times at our committee meetings, is that this plan is a fluid plan. And that's exactly why, depending on what retirements we have, that changes some of those figures. If, it's some of the higher cost staff that retire, maybe that number goes down. Of course, like I mentioned, with the lower COLA, we will have to potentially increase those numbers. And that's why the plan also needs to be fluid, and we need to have multiple items identified just beyond staffing to try to help balance our budget.
Does the same go for classified stuff? Also?
Yes.
Same
Correct,
scenario?
with classified as well. And then in terms of timing of when do we know what these positions will be, we will have to be able to have those positions identified by February, because our February board meeting is when we need to make decisions about any potential reductions that we're going to have, because all of our employees, it is a state requirement that they be informed by March 15th if they're going to be released.
How about custodial staff and maintenance?
It's the same for all staff, that timeline.
But did we identify?
So when we
if
just
you-
say classified, we're including all
Oh, we are. Okay.
factors, all factors. But again, we can only reduce staff if they're not needed, right? So there's going to be staff that even if they leave, it's going to be a position we still need. So that's where that evaluation piece goes in, because there are services that we're required to provide that certain positions must be maintained in the district. And so I go back again to reiterating, the sooner we know from individuals what their plans are, the more helpful that will be. And there always is the possibility that if someone receives a March 15th notice and we find out, later on that a person's retiring or moving that has that same position, they can be called back in, but there's rules around that too. But the unfortunate thing is we have to give notice very early, just so people can prepare and make plans for their families, right? So that's where that March 15th deadline comes into play.
It's the difference between that and a hiring freeze.
So again, a hiring freeze, like Dr. Fuentes mentioned, there's certain positions that are required. So, a strict hiring freeze we could implement and not fill positions, but there's positions that are required. So there's, for instance, paraeducator positions that are required. So if we had a hiring freeze, we would still have to hire those folks. So it's something that we're definitely looking at, and we're evaluating every position that's vacant during this process. And those are the first positions too that we would look at as far as eliminating our positions that are vacant positions or unfilled positions. Those would go first.
Yeah, I mean, if we have to resort to staffing reductions, obviously, as you said, starting off with not filling the positions where people retire or they leave, but then maybe a hiring freeze to seeing. Yeah, I know there's positions that you can't, not replace people, that you have to replace them just to
Right.
meet the state, requirements. But
Right.
maybe we could look at that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, in terms of looking at that priority focus, right? Looking at retirements first, reevaluating vacant positions. Do we need them? Do we not need them? As people leave, evaluating those positions. Do we need them? Do we not need them? Then the other reality too is we also brought in a lot of positions with COVID funding to support COVID needs, and those dollars are now exhausted. So that would be the next layer of positions that we would look at, is positions that can no longer be funded by those one-time dollars that we had.
And I will say that's one of the things that happened over the past 2 to 3 years with COVID that's out of the norm. The state gave a lot of one-time dollars, with the caveat that school districts maintain and use those dollars for staffing. However, we don't have temporary positions. And so unfortunately, we have a level of staffing that's funded by one-time dollars that then expire. And that's typically not the recommendation when you have one-time funds, is to use them for staffing because they're one-time in nature. There's other positions too that may seem like they're a vacancy that could be eliminated, but the reality is that they're filled by then contracted position. For instance, we've had a vacant HVAC technician position since that person retired. We haven't been able to fill that position. So we've had a contractor that has to come out and do the services when our HVAC units break down, because we don't have the staff on hand to be able to address those issues. So that's a position where it's unfilled. It's not necessarily mandated, but we incur a much higher cost because the position is unfilled. And so the elimination of certain positions like that don't net us any savings. Actually, filling the position would actually net us the savings in this particular instance. So I just wanted to point that out, that all of that type of analysis has to be done when looking at all of these positions, especially ones that are outside of the ones that are directly in the classroom.
About looking at, reduced hours and furloughs for staff as well as part of staffing reductions, since it's all staffing.
That's possible. And so one of the things was staffing ratio. So we actually have one of our administrative regulations that does state the number of hours for certain staff, clerks, secretaries, et cetera. And so that is something that we can look at. We are over those ratios in some instances, and so we can make reductions there. Furloughs, again, that's something that is a negotiated item, and that we would have to approach our bargaining units about that. And with furloughs too, there's a certain number of required school days. There's staff that are required to be in the particular classroom for those amount of days, but that's also a possibility.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because that's something I would suggest, if we're going to look at staff reductions, that we look at every possibility, not just cutting positions, but also possibly, reducing hours for staff that are going to stay on, right? Because it's a shared pain, I think, among everybody. And then also furloughs. And obviously, that's something that, like you said, has to be negotiated. So maybe having those discussions.
Correct.
Any further questions on staffing reductions? And again, this is hard because we're talking about people's lives. And so we do not want to proceed lightly with this. And but it's definitely an option to help with the financial situation here at the district. The last recommendation was the SERP, Supplemental Early Retirement Plan. And we did talk at the outset about a SERP. And we're not quite sure at this point, based on the data the certificated data, if this would pencil out. And the district just did one, I think it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, we have 2 more payments left for the previous one. So if you all remember, the previous one was a pretty lucrative incentive. And so I believe to achieve around $700,000 in savings, we needed at least, I want to say it was a dozen certificated staff to take that incentive. So if something similar were offered, it would require a significant amount more of staff to take that incentive. And I don't know that we have that amount of eligible staff. Now, that doesn't mean that an incentive would have to be structured in the same way. But just giving that as an example, but we are looking into that and trying to get that data from our financial advisor.
Wait, you said that this was done 3 years ago? How many folks left because of this incentive? Like how many individuals?
I believe
Are
it
you-
was 19 total.
19?
Is that about right, Josh? You remember? 19? Yeah.
And that, do you know how much it netted off the top of your head?
It was around 700,000.
Yeah,
So that's
700,000.
19 inclusive of both certificated, classified, and management.
Okay.
So you have you said you have 2 more payments from the last
Yes.
one, and how much is that? And
How much is it per year?
yeah,
Yeah, so around $500,000.
so when those payments and
That expenditure will drop off
Will
of
drop
the
off, right?
multi-year. Yes.
and that's included in our projections.
Yes. Right now, that last payment is in year 3, but soon we'll make it in a few months when we generate next year's budget. Year 3 will be a new year and that will drop off. So our first payment for that particular plan was in 2021, 22. No, it was 5 years. Yes, it was 5 annual payments, and that was for 90% of the salary.
So ladies and gentlemen, we've been at this now for almost 2 hours. And time has flown, and I want to thank you for your attention, for your questions. And I want to go back to one of Craig's original slides where he talked about perception. Well, the budget problem isn't real. I hope as you've gone through these slides and looked at this information, the budget challenge is real. The county has weighed in, and you saw some of the excerpts from the letter. The county has serious concerns about the district's financial viability. So at this point, the district has control on how to address these issues moving forward. There are districts that have lost control. And someone from the outside has come in and essentially tells the district what to do. At this juncture, as you look at all the information, as you assess the information, you all still have control. And so as you look at the last bullets as far as next steps, as Dr. Fuentes has mentioned, getting some direction on the sale of district property and also on the possibility of school consolidation. As the district is wrestling with this issue of financial viability. At this point, the district is okay. It can still meet its financial obligations. But as you can see, those ending balances are running very thin. And recommendations number 3 and 4 were included in the graphs, but really no decision has been made yet on those. So December 13th is a pretty important date where the district will have to essentially approve the recommendations made by the Budget Stabilization Committee and the recommendations, and then also approve the first interim budget. So with that, and then the last bullet, we are waiting for the governor's budget for 24-25, and that will come out in the beginning, middle part of January. So that concludes the presentation. Pending any questions that you might have of myself or Craig, and any comments from Dr. Fuentes.
Thank you. First, I do want to allow the board, if there's any additional questions, you have the opportunity for that. Otherwise, we'll move into the first bullet. And so as we look at all of these recommendations that have been put forth and that the committee has discussed, you know, the first recommendation with leasing is already in process, right? We have our RFP out for the Piedmont Park location. We have an existing lease with the Birchwood location. We have potential with additional portables and classroom space, and we're open to, you know, maximizing those lease opportunities, and we'll continue to engage with our partners in that area to bring in any additional revenue that we can. The next bullet was the potential sale of property. That requires also additional analysis. We'll have to update, reassess those properties to get more current value, and also look into, you know, whether it's parcels, if it's whole acreage, you know, what are those combinations thereof? Do we want to generate an RFP to see what that interest would be? There's all of those thoughts to be considered. You also brought up additional ideas for repurposing existing land like Commodore. You mentioned the ideas of the stations, et cetera. I know Mr. Franklin shared a bit of the research he's done, but if you would like to see that more formally, we can provide that so you know how that cost out and what that potential is. So let's start with that item. You know, what is the feedback from the board? What would you like to see us do?
So I have one additional question that's not on here, and we didn't
Sure.
really discuss it, but it's, so contract services district has, I know some are, you know, required or some are specifically funded by the state, but can we review those as well, just to see maybe we can make some savings there?
Mhm.
Yeah, so we looked through all of our contracted services and we've done that analysis to make those reductions. There's potentially some areas for reduction in some of our special ed contracts in particular, but we have done that analysis and we pretty much made those reductions already, and anything that we currently have in contracted services is because it's required. So again, there's some of those areas too, like I mentioned with like HVAC services and things of that nature, where if we have staff that can do it, we would realize the savings, but at the moment we don't have staff in certain positions.
But if you'd like a report analysis of that so you can see what that looks like, we can provide that to you.
Yeah, I think that'd be good, just, you know, so we know, and then so the
Mhm.
public and everybody else knows as well.
Sure.
Yeah, it's embedded in the documents, but I know
Right,
it
right,
gets
right. Yeah, they're
very
all over. Yeah, they're all
weedy
over
to
the
look
place,
at. Yes.
And so regarding the sale of property, yes, so, you know, I think that looking at various options for that, this is my opinion, you know, so not only looking at entire parcels, because like I said, I'm not, you know, too keen on selling entire, you know, sites, but possibilities of selling portions of them. Also, you know, like the Commodore site, it's a, you know, it's a nice site and it's already zoned for residential, but perhaps, you know, I think that neighborhood could also use an amenity. So maybe a combination. So if developers say willing to or open to the idea of maybe, you know, doing cash in an exchange. So in exchange for, you know, certain amount of land, there's cash and also like infrastructure for some amenities for the community or something we can use to generate some funding. You know, just different ways of going about it, not just straight sale of an entire parcel. And all that stuff, kind of, you know, brainstorm the rest and, you know, some other ideas. So that one, and then I think maybe and I know, again, I wouldn't want to sell the entire Piedmont, you know, the former district office property, but maybe looking at a portion of that and then a portion of the Birchwood. I don't know. I mean, I like to keep Milpitas Christian as a tenant because it generates revenue there. But if we have, 10 acres there and, they're not using the entirely, or if there's a portion of that, that's also some prime, potential residential land there.
So I will mention that there's a potential tenant for the Piedmont Road property.
Okay.
We just heard about it yesterday. So so that was new, and
All right.
that's a new interest. And so we're trying to gauge the seriousness of the interest. And from what I've gathered so far, they're inquiring about a lease because that's what's in the RFP. They are also interested in purchase if it was available for purchase, is my understanding. But again, we'd have to actually meet with them. And so that meeting's, we're trying to set that meeting up in the next week or two to gauge that interest. And again, with Birchwood, my opinion on Birchwood from the last lease extension with Milpitas Christian is that the site needs significant upgrades. I don't know what the long-term viability is of them as a tenant in its current status because of the concerns that they mentioned with the site. And how much it costs to upgrade it. So that's some of the things to consider with that property.
There's a question of, are they going to be a tenant? I mean, they've been a tenant for 30 years.
They've been a tenant for 40 years.
40 years, yeah.
But I don't know how interested they are in upgrading that site because as we saw, it needs a significant amount of work.
Okay.
I think just for clarification for staff, I know Trustee Jimenez, it's your interest to explore potential parcels for sale, not whole sites. But what about the rest of our trustees? Because we need consensus from everyone.
So my position is that one item that I'm actually opposed against is selling any district property. And the reasoning for that is I just look at the history of what Berryessa has done. Going back to, I'm not sure the exact date when we sold the property at Berryessa and Capitol, the old Berryessa school. I believe that was about 35, 40 years ago. I actually talked with a parent that went to that school. So I know it's not many decades ago. It's pretty in recent memory. And I don't know what the situation was back then. I think it was either in the late 80s or early 90s when we sold that property. But we're in the same situation we're in now. I don't know what we use with the revenue for that property. So I'd be interested in learning how much we sold it for and how much it's valued now. Have we held on to it?
Right. So I don't know exactly when it was sold. And I wasn't doing research on that, but doing research through board agenda items for a different purpose back from the 80s. What I do know was that the district was either directed by the city to sell property or it was the district's decision back then to sell certain properties because there wasn't, for instance, a bond available to upgrade facilities. And so I believe that modernization that was done in the early to mid 90s was done from the sale of the properties. And so I believe there were a few different sites that were sold back then in the mid to late 80s, early 90s. And those funds, I believe, were used for some of the modernization of some of our school sites. But that I don't have the exact.
That goes back to what I was saying. That money could have been gained through a bond opposed to selling property. So we lost essentially millions of dollars that we held onto that property. And same goes with the Flickinger site. About 20 years ago, we sold that site too. And where's the revenue now? It didn't address the structural deficit. We're in the 80s and 90s. We're faced with the same problem, I believe, and we released a huge chunk of our investment. And 20 years ago, we did the same thing. And now we're faced with the same issue. We've never addressed the structural deficit. So I believe my position is land is very valuable in this area, and it's an interest in the district to maintain those property for future investments, whether through different types of leases or developments on those properties. For example, the Birchwood property, we've held onto that property, and now we're still gaining revenue from it as an ongoing revenue. And same with the decision for our when we moved to this district office, we're now leasing we're intending to lease the Piedmont Road office, and we're going to gain an ongoing revenue for that too. So I believe that's a better choice and much more wiser investment for the district is to develop and lease our property opposed to selling it. Same thing with I know we had a conversation about a portion of the Caltauti Park. The district owned a portion of that park too. I don't know what happened to it, but somehow we gave up our rights or we sold that property. How do we benefit from that? So that's something I'd be interested in.
Yeah, so I think that those properties were some of the ones that I saw that were sold for capital facilities projects because that's what those revenues that are generated from the sale of property are intended for, but I couldn't tell you exactly what projects those were. One thing I will mention that the committee discussed, because they had the same viewpoint that you have too, with the value of the properties and how valuable it is to keep them. And that was something that the committee kind of struggled with. And I don't think we mentioned it, so that's why I'm just bringing it forward, is that what the committee's intent was with having those as number one and number two, the lease and then the sale of properties, was because they wanted to try to keep and maintain the services and level of services that we have for our students. And they wanted to keep as much of the reductions out of the classroom as possible. And so that was why they landed on those as the top two, because they struggled with the same kind of concern and with not addressing the actual structural deficit, but they saw that as a way to help the current situation while maintaining the same level of staffing and services for students.
Sell property is, like you said earlier, it goes
one
to
time.
facilities, right?
Mhm.
One-time funding. It doesn't really go to.
Right. We're kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, it doesn't go to programs or
Mhm.
Right.
salaries for employees, really.
Correct.
Mhm.
And that's what our bond is. Correct.
To all of the presentation, and I am opposed as well with selling our properties. I think we should keep them, but I would prefer that we, as a district, look into the leasing of it, because as Kwan mentioned also, that property is so valuable between now and the future. And we are in a location that it can go up, and so higher and higher. So I think it would be best to look into leasing our property rather than selling them off.
What's the, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, what's the potential of leasing, properties such as Commodore or say Birchwood after Milpitas Christian School decides, or if they decide to not continue the lease? Is that something that we see that there's a pretty good chance that that's going to happen?
It just depends on the type of entity and what they're looking for. So it's really hard to say without having put out the RFP.
That's part of the research we would have to do
Yeah.
to be able to bring back, working with our real estate partner and having them be very creative with different types of RFPs to see what generates interest.
Right. I also want to remind everybody that we purchased, so we have another property that we didn't have, even a few years ago when we got this one. So, we have more property now than we've had in a while. So that provides a chance. I mean, we gained an acre and a half here. So selling maybe an acre and a half somewhere else, that would pretty much, put us kind of in a good place for, several years while we did other reductions also that, would be ongoing reductions to cut that structural deficit. So it's kind of a, give and take, right? Like we gained a property and selling a piece of one, I don't think it wouldn't be a net loss, basically.
Well, first of all, I just want to first thank you for the presentation. This is really difficult work, and this is a really difficult conversation to have, but it's a necessary one to ensure that we have fiscal solvency within our district. And my opinions is that I am on the same page. I don't want to sell whole properties, but I do agree that we could sell small acres, like a small amount, just to see that immediate dollar amount come in and to take advantage of that June deadline that we have. And I am on board with leasing our properties as well, but I am particularly interested in land leasing the sites that do not have facilities. And similar to the excess sites program that the housing department within the state has, I believe it's under the jurisdiction of the governor. I think it's DGS that handles the excess sites program. The state also has a lot of excess sites, but what they do is that they lease out that land to get revenue and to have other developers do what they want with the land. So we wouldn't be responsible for the maintaining that land or anything like that. And so that's something that I'm particularly interested in. Housing unfortunately is a commodity here, but it is a lot of money if a developer comes around and says, I want to develop something here, but we still own that land. So it could net us something very high since we still own the land. And so it's kind of a compromise between selling and leasing because, you know, they own everything that's above and on the land, but not the land itself. And so we still gain that revenue from renting, you know, using that land. And it is something new, but it's something that I think would be really good for the district in the long run. But I recognize that this will be a long discussion and it will have a lot of research. I don't know any districts, you know, off the top of my head that is pursuing something like this, but I would really enjoy it and see if Berryessa could come to something that we could do. I mean, it also doesn't have to be housing. It can also, I'm very interested in the EV chargers idea. I think that's a really good idea. And to especially take advantage of the federal government's programs. And I would also encourage us to reach out to the county to see if they may be interested in our lands. I don't know if the Office of Ed would have anything that they would like to use from us or any other county program. I know that even though the state and the city is facing more of a deficit, the county has a bit more of a cushion. So maybe they might have extra to help us with as well. So those are my thoughts on the issue.
And just to answer one of the questions you had before, we did look up what the Senate bill was that gave that flexibility, and it was Senate Bill 98, and that was enacted June 29th, 2020.
Sorry, SB, what number?
98.
98.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm the only one left to provide my thoughts on this. Land leases, I mean, it's very interesting. And to echo the sentiments of my fellow board members, I'm not in favor of selling at all. Maybe bits and pieces, but that doesn't sound very appealing to me. But retaining property is definitely something we should, consider. We should not be selling anything. With the land leases, especially for my worry is with building of homes. San Jose is now doing a multi-level building like they're doing on Capitol. They have like a 7-story building coming up over there. So my worry is if we do lease out or do something like that, is there potential for San Jose City to come after us and say, I'm going to put up like a 7-story building in a neighborhood full of single-family homes? Is that something you can elaborate?
So the beauty with land leasing is that we are still the landlord. So we have the power to say, okay, we have the power to go out in the market and say, okay, we want this building. It would essentially be an RFP, but for what we want on the site. And so we don't have to say that we want like a 10-story high building, right? But we would still own the property and we would still run into problems with the city of San Jose. But with the city of San Jose, they are a pro-housing city. And so they would want a little higher density. But what they're really looking at and what I believe they would be akin to is like fourplexes, duplexes, like homes that are slightly densified. So a lot of the neighborhoods within Berryessa is a lot of single family homes. And, it's just your regular, like, you have a garage, whatever. It's like everything that you look around. But the city would be akin to something like with that softer density, like townhomes or something that has like the ability to house 4 families instead of just one, but still looks like a house. Like if you walk in downtown San Jose in District 3, you'll actually see a lot of these they look like Victorian homes and they have like 2 different doors. Like that's a duplex. So that's something that would be interesting to look at. Or like we could even look into something similar to around like, honestly, the BART station like has lower density housing and like it could fit inside the neighborhood. So it's not like, I don't think the city of San Jose would be opposed to that. And we do have contacts within the city to ask like preliminarily, and developers also have contacts within the city to see like what the development they're looking at would be like and see. The problem with the Oak Grove is that the district asked them, or the developer brought them something that was extremely low density, and the city really did not like that. But if we are able to come up with a plan or work with a developer who's more familiar with the city and the developer and the planners within the city, we don't have to run into that issue. Like having someone who's more familiar with the city and what they like and what they don't like, we may not run into that problem, and understanding that process. My understanding with the Oak Grove site is that it's too low density and it doesn't match what the city wants. But if we have a high enough density, the city will leave us alone. Like they'll be like, we need housing. And it's like, we want it to fit the character of our neighborhoods. And like, I think something that's like mid density, like what I'm talking about, like something similar to what we have in like, not downtown core, but like the outskirts of downtown, those Victorian homes, duplexes, fourplexes, those kinds of opportunities could be there. But that, of course, this is a long process. I'm not saying that this is going to be an immediate return, but it's something that I am personally interested in, and I think is something that school districts could do in the future.
So my understanding is any type of lease like that would be eligible to be used in the general fund. However, we would still have the rezoning to do for all of those sites, because even though Commodore, for instance, is residential, I believe it's low density residential in zoning. And so it would have to be rezoned to do something like that, even if we were to do a land lease.
Have you heard of situations where districts or school districts will lease out new land leases and partner with developers for workforce housing? Or, 'cause I think that would be a benefit for employees.
Yeah, so that is something. So someone that does do workforce housing reached out today to try to set up a meeting to discuss that. And so, yes, that is possible. But even with that, just with the cost, a couple of them that I've seen, it doesn't pay for the entire project, because the projects are pretty significant in cost. And so you'd have to find other means to be able to offset that. But there are some instances where developers will fund the entire amount, and then you have an agreement over time to recoup those funds.
So I think just based on what I'm hearing, this is definitely a topic that's worthy of potentially a study session that we can bring forward with. I know our counsel, Harold Freeman, who works with us on our properties, is very knowledgeable in land leasing, workforce housing, and all those options that districts are pursuing. So we can certainly look at that. And that idea is not confined to this 6-month window. So it's something that we do have time to dig in and see if there are potential partnerships that can be established for that type of a revenue stream.
The one other idea that I had, I think we spoke about it maybe once, was to build a center of performing arts in the in Berryessa, because I don't think we have one center of performing arts where we can have music programs or arts and culture, some facility like that in our district. Even if we decide to close the site, maybe we can build a center of performing arts there. Maybe that could be in partnership with other school districts that can benefit from having a center of performing arts where they can have the flexibility of having the performances at an off-site location. So something like that is also something to think about, to look at utilizing some of those lands and trying to see if that would help us with some kind of revenue stream generation. I don't know how much it will, but utilizing those sites effectively in a meaningful way. But yeah, it does need more discussion for sure.
So the the idea of lease, it's a good one, but that's it's time. It would take time. I don't know how many, and we don't have much time, right? We have to start either generating some revenue pretty soon here, or make cuts. And so the other option, right, is staff layoffs or school closures. So in the meantime, until these ideas pan out, we'll have to look at reductions now or closing schools. So that's kind of the trade-off. Whereas, that's why I'm against selling land also, but it's like having money in the bank and not using it, and then, starving, for a few days just because you don't want to use that money. Or if you have stocks, right, because it appreciates in value. So, I mean, that's just something, I think that people should consider. Are we ready to make the decisions of, releasing staff and closing schools, which to me are much uh, less savory choices than, say, selling an acre of land here and there.
Well, I know it's an unpopular topic on consolidating, merging, or closing schools, but I think that, I mean, our growing has declined significantly. Quarter of it is actually one quarter was around 8,000 students. Now we're a little over 6,000, so we lost a quarter of our student population. And going back to what Trustee Srinivasan was saying, I've always thought that K through 6 schools, I don't know the data behind it or the research on is it more beneficial compared to K through 5. I know maybe district is maybe K through 6. I'm not sure if that's possible, because what I like to avoid is closing elementary schools. I think that's a more impactful thing for communities, because younger kids, they live closer to those schools. They can walk. Their parents can drive them to that school if it's close. I think maybe it's a worthwhile conversation to have to maybe move some of those 6th graders back to the elementary school, like our neighboring districts in Peters. Maybe close the middle school, because I know the cost savings is a lot higher at the middle school level. I think that's a conversation worth having too, because I know at the middle school level they're at a vulnerable age, and we need to give them as much services and programs as possible. And if there's one less middle school, more programs and services can be made available to those students at those 2 schools. And also, just look at our neighborhood, they have 2 middle schools, and they have a much larger district than us. So I don't know how that compares or what the research has done. But I think this is an unpopular conversation to have, but I think that's one of the best solutions that we probably need to explore. Again, it all goes back to just the numbers. We've lost a quarter of our students, but we're still maintaining, the same number of schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. And exactly the suggestion that you put up for consideration is what this committee would do. They would go through and they would explore and do the research for all of those different types of configurations. And that brings us into the second item that we're seeking direction on, is just the ability to be able to move forward and commence this committee and the phase 1 process of doing all the data analysis that I described earlier. So that way potential scenarios can be brought back to the board for consideration.
I would say we should move forward with starting that committee to review. And great idea to close a middle school for higher cost savings and bring back K to 6. I think it's a good idea.
I'd say nothing's off the table, right? I mean, we have to make cuts, so I'm open. Again, I don't want to do that, but if it comes down to it, we'll have to. I just think there are other options we can explore as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't want the direction to be to look at closing a middle school. I would much rather the direction to be consider the options, because I don't want to scare our community in saying that we're going to close one of the middle schools. I want us to evaluate all the potential options and give proper notice. So I would rather not direct, elementary or middle. I want them to look at everything first and then
And that's
decide.
that's exactly what they would do. They would, and maybe create a scenario we haven't thought of as well. That would also be the task of the committee.
Yeah, I would wait. I would really wait for their recommendation rather than, because closing schools is never easy, and moving staff is very difficult, and laying off people is even worse. So I would just go. For me personally, I would prefer that we look into it, research it carefully, and go from there.
As far as staffing cuts, when was the last time we had made layoffs?
It's been many years, none during my time here. And so this is my 7th year.
Yeah, my understanding from talk with some of the principals that have been here long-term was, I think in the 2009, 2010 timeframe, somewhere around
Yeah,
there.
just knowing,
during the
just,
Great
I think
Recession.
trending with all the other school districts, things were pretty bad before 2012. So between 28 to 2012, I think that would be my guess. I wasn't a board member, but just kind of knowing and kind of knowing some history from some past board members.
Okay, I was asking that because I just pride myself in working in a district where we don't do layoffs. I don't remember ever making any layoffs during my tenure. So I know for the past 15 years we haven't done any layoffs. But just going back to the potential staff reduction, I just want to be transparent. Are we talking about reduction in programs? Because you're talking about not backfilling people, but a lot of these like certificate positions, you got to backfill because there's classrooms. You can't just eliminate teachers. So are we talking about like reducing like instructional coaches or like eliminating that program, or what kind of programs?
So definitely looking at itinerant staff because we want to make sure we are far removed from the classroom, right? You still need to maintain, your classroom teachers, your support staff that are in that classroom with those students. That's the priority. But we would look at itinerant positions. We would look at our management positions.
So can you give some examples? I know like
So
media
for
techs have been brought up in the past. And
So in terms of certificated staff, when we look at what are itinerant positions that are not providing, that don't have a roster of children, right? It's our instructional coaches as one group. We have our social workers as another group. Everyone else carries roster of children, whether they're a special ed specialist or a classroom teacher. So those would be the itinerant positions. For classified, we have all of our paras, they all support our students directly in the classroom. We have instructional associates that support students directly in the classroom. But then you have all your other operational support staff where you do get into the discussion of the level of service that you want to have. Your librarians, your health clerks, your office staff, your custodial support. Some of the positions that we've increased service as a result of the COVID pandemic is we've increased custodial support at the sites. We also created additional clerk positions at the sites to help support with those health needs. So those are all new services that came with some of those one-time dollars. And then, like I said, with management, every division right now is reviewing all of the support team that they have, and we're looking to see how we can restructure and realign responsibilities there.
Okay, thank you for that. So that goes back to my proposed solution of potentially merging schools. If we merge schools and we close one schools, we don't have to backfill those positions at the school that we're closing. So that way, when someone does retire or resigns from the district, we don't have to replace that principal for that school that's being closed, for that custodian staff, the media techs, for the social worker, that school that's being closed. So I think that addresses the issue of staff reduction as well. More meaningful than this. Otherwise, having to lay off folks.
Yeah, and those were the discussions that the committee had, and Michael brings it up all the time about soft landing, long runway, and looking at those positions. And so knowing that that's the direction, we would look at some of those positions as we start this process so that there aren't those layoffs that need to occur. And so if it's looking at consolidating and merging schools, like you mentioned, then when we do have those retirements or those resignations, then we would look at not backfilling at that point and how do we support in the meanwhile until this process concludes.
So I have a question. How permanent are school closures?
Well,
Does that make sense, the question?
well, Birchwood was closed 40 plus years ago.
So chances of a school, say, in 5-10 years time, say the enrollment numbers go back up. The chances of reopening a school are slim to none, basically.
Based on Tom Williams' report,
I was just going to say, keep
Right.
in mind
Yes.
that our demographer's report is a 5 to 7 year
Right.
time frame, and he has our enrollment continuing to decline throughout that period.
But it would take 3 years to close the schools. That would put us at within 4 years of his last,
It would take a year.
a year,
Mhm.
starting from today.
It takes, again, it depends on the conversations of the committee. I can't timestamp that. But the intention would be to work through the process so it could be realized for the 25-26 school year, as you saw in that slide on where that savings would impact our multi-year budget.
So I believe Cupertino had recently closed 3 of their schools in under a year. This past year or so.
Yes, you're correct. Those transitions went into effect this year.
yeah, I mean, we know of instances where it's been done significantly faster, and that was not the
Absolutely.
intent of the committee.
And not advised.
Right.
I would just add, there was a district in Southern California that ended up closing 4 schools within 1 year. And the outcry from the community was tremendous. And again, as I've mentioned before, give yourself a long enough runway to get this initiative off the ground and plenty of time for the community to provide its input.
So I attended a breakout session at CSBA conference where they're discussing the closure of Cupertino schools. There was tremendous pushback on the closure of Cupertino schools. You got, very hostile. Law enforcement was called in, threats were being made to school board members, parents were upset. But by the time the school closed, parents were coming to school board members, thanking them because now their students at the schools that are welcoming those schools, because their students are now getting more services and programs as a result of that, because now instead of spreading the services and programs across a multitude of schools, now it's more confined to one school. So the students at that one school is getting more programs and services. And I think that's the ultimate goal. That sometimes gets overlooked. And that's what I was going back to the middle school level. At that age, you need as much programs and services as possible instead of spreading across the schools. It's more beneficial for the student to have it, 2 schools. And at the middle school level, a lot of times parents are driving their students across the district. So it's a lot less impactful, in my opinion, than at the elementary school level, where a lot more students walk to school. They need that neighborhood school. Oftentimes, elementary schools are poor community in that area. So that's why I like to avoid merging, consolidating elementary schools if at all possible. But I know that's also about the discussion.
And just so the board knows what the existing reality is in our schools, there's impacts at both elementary and middle school that's being experienced right now. So, at the elementary level, and we'll be sharing site-specific enrollment data with the board next week at our regular board meeting. And, we have two elementary schools that are under 300 students. One of them is under 250 students. And the result of that is increased combination classrooms, right? So that's a very challenging programming experience for those students. And they've already been experiencing that for a few years because they've been below 250 for a little while. And then in addition on the other side with the middle school programming, the impact, as Trustee Nguyen said, is programs and services, reduced elective offerings, trying to maintain our music programs, choir, not being able to offer foreign language that we'd like to be able to do, right? That requires additional staffing to have those elective offerings there. So there is opportunity to be able to increase those program options for our students when we have more consolidated at one site than what we currently do. So I would just say that the programming is being impacted at both levels currently, and that's definitely a big part of the conversation that the committee will engage in, and especially, Our parents are going to be part of that committee as well. So it gives them an opportunity to also share what is that learning experience they'd like to have for their child? What do they hope for in terms of programming and supports in their schools? And that will also help inform the committee with the different potential scenarios that they may create and bring back to the board for consideration.
I understand the impact of, having really small schools, too small, right? Too low enrollment, but I'm just worried about, the optics of, we have all this excess land, potential funds, right? And now we're gonna, close schools as opposed to, just the optics of that in the community. And then, so now we have even more surplus land, right? With more, if we consolidate schools. So are we hoarding land and, closing schools? So that's my concern. So that's why, my feeling is that nothing should be off the table when it comes to looking at generating revenue and then also savings.
Yeah, the committee was really specific about that as well. So it's good that you mentioned that, because we did mention that when you do a school consolidation or merger and you do have that additional school site, that's why the top priority was, according to the committee, to lease the vacant property, because that was what they saw as a way to then generate revenue in addition to just the cost of the closing of the school site. And so that was very intentional by the committee to place the leasing of vacant sites as number one.
So one thing, just want to clarify also, just to ask this question. So sale of a property, the realization from of the revenue from the sale of a property, the timeline is longer and the funds are more restricted versus closing a particular school site, and the funds are the revenue realization is almost immediate, and the funds are unrestricted. Is that accurate?
Yes, except that we're not generating revenue from the reduction of the school site. What we're doing is we're generating a savings in expenditures. So until
And then
something that
potential
revenue,
revenue with
correct.
that space, once it becomes available.
Correct.
But those funds are more unrestricted than the funds from generated from sale of a property.
Lease revenues are unrestricted completely. So, but sale of property is entirely restricted, with the exception of this SB 98 flexibility.
Yeah, but our direction today wouldn't be to sell a property. It'd be just to explore what that would look like and kind of what that would do, right? I mean, it's not, we're going to go sell the property tomorrow or list it up for for sale tomorrow. It's exploring how much can we get, what are the options. So
Yes.
that's why I don't think it's a good idea to not even look at that, to not even consider that.
Any further feedback?
I think it's important that we truly do need to address our structural deficit and not just kick the can down the road, however we do it. I just want to put that out there.
I think I would also add for the board that given the amount of funds that need to be recovered, whether it's through reduction or increased revenue, we're going to need to do a combination of these recommendations. So I don't want anyone to feel like it's one over the other. Most likely, it's going to be a combination of multiple points of the recommendations being made. But knowing that the reason we focused on the sale of property, or specifically land leasing and school merging, is because there's additional research that needs to be done in order to continue to bring that forward for conversation and decision. And we want to make sure we prioritize staff's time in those directions that the board would like that feedback on.
So I'll still remember, thanks to both of you for your work, and thanks to all the committee members for putting together this presentation, working hard, and having those tough conversations. If we haven't already said that, one of the things that stood out in the presentation just as a matter of perspective, I mean, we as board members, as people that are involved in the school district, may understand this, but from an outsider community member perspective, this slide number 13, I don't know if you want to go back to that slide number 13, that shows the ending fund balance history. It shows it's 22% down to 3%. From a outsider, uninterested party, community member perspective, which I was not too long ago, that steep drop without attribution looks like mismanagement to me, right? As a complete uninterested party. So along with this data, if we can publish perspective of how these funds were used, we understand that there was an increase in all the costs, salaries, and so on, and things like that. That's perfectly fine, but just to add appropriate attribution to this chart would be helpful. So if it does get published on our website or something like that, I would suggest having links to specific why on this. Otherwise, it looks a little odd. That's just my feedback.
The narrative.
Gotcha. Yeah, and we can do that. There's FAQs that we have that kind of talk about some of these things right now on the website. It doesn't necessarily mesh that story together necessarily, but the other thing that I want to remind everyone too is that over this same time frame, we've had huge increases in retirement contributions that are statutorily required for STRS and PERS that weren't necessarily projected 5, 6, 7 years ago, and those are unforeseen things. So for instance, like the district STRS contribution, I think 8 years ago was around 9 or 10%. It's 19% now, so that's a 10% increase on all of our certificated salaries, be it management, teaching staff, what have you. Same thing for for PERS. PERS has gone up even more than that, and PERS is around 28%, and that's not what it was 5 or 6 years ago. It's significantly lower, and those are very significant impacts to the budget that were not foreseen. They're analyzed year by year, and then those rates have been raised. So I do want to point out some of those things too, because that's the narrative we do try to explain with all of the different budget presentations. And then like I mentioned before, liability insurance and those type of lawsuits, just in the 4 years that I've been here, it's more than it's almost tripled in cost. So
I completely agree. Like I said,
right,
for
that's
us,
good.
we understand.
Yeah.
But when it gets projected without
Yeah.
that reference point, it becomes like, what is the school district
Right.
doing, kind of a thing, right? And we don't want to project that kind of a image. So.
Right. And so that's good to know so that we can help tell that story more clearly on the website.
What you just mentioned, one of the structural deficit issues we have is the contribution to the employee retirement benefits. Are you familiar with any situations where we can address that issue? For example, setting a trust and contributing to that trust to help pay those increased contributions? Yeah, so we have Fund 17 or Fund 20. Fund 20, right, is the OPEB. It's typically for our contributions that are outside of our pension costs. You can set that up as a irrevocable trust, and you can earn. And Michael's even mentioned setting something up like that. But it's a matter of then having those dollars in there. Right now, we have the flexibility from the county to utilize those dollars to support our general fund right now. And so if we set up a trust, we wouldn't have access to those funds. And so that's kind of the dynamic. But it's specifically to pay for the increases to PERS and STRS. The board would have to take action to actually set something up like that. And it would have to be done in a trust like that. Other districts have taken action when they had high reserves to commit funds specifically to the increases to STRS and PERS. But unfortunately, what
what we experience in the Bay Area is we just have a higher cost of living than everywhere else, and that impacts all of our families. That puts the pressure on us as a district to compete and have those high salaries so that our folks and our staff can afford to live in the area, or at least close enough that they can work here. And so that's just some of the financial pressures that we have. And I've mentioned it before about how low our revenue per student is. And so that's just, there's nothing that's specific to it. And what the governor has said, and a lot of his budgets are, here's some one-time dollars that should address your retirement issues. But they're saying you can address your retirement issues, keep your staffing the same, increase services for students, provide social workers, provide counselors, because all of our students need this coming out of the pandemic for learning recovery. And so with a district like ours that, does not get as much revenue per student because we don't have the amount of unduplicated students that generate the one-time dollars that we were getting, it's just that balance of how do we do that? Do we allocate those funds towards the additional retirement costs to keep staffing the same? And so we've been juggling that over the past couple of years. So really, what we've been trying to do is through advocacy for the governor and the legislature to actually dedicate specific funding or to reduce those rates that had happened in the past pre-pandemic, but coming out of the pandemic, it was more of just, here's some one-time dollars that we'll give to you and do what you need with it. And that's how the governor addressed the issues.
As like a final note, I just want to say that, as we go through this process, my number one will always be considering the student. I want to make sure that our students still have the best quality education, and that, if they need services, we still provide it to them as much as possible, especially our highest need students. Usually their families are the ones who will be desperately impacted by the decisions that we make in the future. So I always want to emphasize, cutting away from the classroom, reserving our mental health, facilities or people and folks that they need to continue to be supported. And so that's always going to be my guiding northern light in this process, because I really want to make sure that our most affected families, communities aren't as hurt by this, and we land standing on our feet, we land softly, but I'm confident that we can get through this.
Dr. Fuentes, can you summarize what are the next steps?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So as we mentioned before, in terms of the recommendations from the committee, that the leasing options are already at play, and we're working through those and hopefully increasing opportunity with leasing. The staffing reduction component is an ongoing review process as we look at the mobility of our staff and the decisions they make. And I went over the priority of how we will evaluate that. That will come back to the board in February in order to meet a March deadline wherever we land at that time. Then in looking at here for property sale consideration. So what I heard were two things. I heard one, the interest in land leasing and exploring what the opportunities might be there, knowing that that is a longer pathway, but we have the ability to be able to research that and start to look at potential possibilities. I heard strong intent on not selling property from the majority of the board, but potential looking at parcels. How would that play out? So we can certainly do that. But knowing that when it comes to property sale, the higher interest is going to come in the entire property. We already know that, but I did hear strong disregard for moving forward in that direction. And then again, the final one was looking at school consolidation, and I heard approval to go ahead and commence the committee to be able to start doing, again, that's going to be a lengthy phase one process of looking at all the different variables. And as I mentioned, there's new state requirements that we need to follow too in doing that analysis, and that'll be part of that committee's conversation. Okay, you're welcome.
And then also the staffing reductions.
Oh, I mentioned that,
Oh, okay.
that it would go through the priority process that I mentioned, that we're looking at retirements first, mobility, reevaluating vacancies, seeing what matches there. But then, we are going to have to meet that quotient numbers that we looked at, and we'll have to bring that to the board in February for action based on where our staffing is at that point in time.
We'll have another discussion on staffing later. I mean, I guess
Well,
we're going to have a discussion.
February will be for action.
Okay.
Once we know, because there's moving parts to that, depending on people's decisions for themselves on where they are for retirement, new opportunities, etc. But like I said, our priority is to first look at retirees, to look at vacant positions, what can be eliminated with vacant positions. That will all count towards those numbers. And then, and then reevaluating positions that we currently have based on funding, positions that are funded on those one-time dollars that are exhausted, right? We'll go down in that order.
We look at reduction in hours and furloughs as well.
That'll be discussion with our labor partners.
Gotcha. Okay,
Mhm.
thanks.
Studies on the changes in the consolidation of schools, for example, K through 8, K through 6, is there benefits on which
School configuration.
Correct.
Mhm. Okay. All right.
Okay, so is there any other input from the board? Any other questions? Alma? There's nothing further from the board. Motion adjourned.
Move to adjourn.
Second. Move to second. All in favor, adjourn, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting's adjourned at 8:51 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, Michael and Craig, for your support in this conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Thelma. I'm going to end your call, okay? Have a good one.
Oh, just for to make sure, are you still there?
Let me call you on my cell phone, okay? Because you're still on the speaker.
Okay.
Thank you. All right.